It was a quiet Sunday morning in Geneva, and I was reviewing quarterly reports from our family's investment portfolio. The gentle hum of my laptop was the only sound in my home office when the notification appeared on my screen. A banking alert. Something I'd seen thousands of times before in my career as an international investment manager. But this one was different. This one made me smile. Warning: attempted access to all primary accounts. Multiple large transfers initiated. My wife Claire had finally made her move. I leaned back in my leather chair, the Swiss sun warming my face through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and thought about how predictable people become when they think they're being clever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Claire had just emptied every account she knew about. Our joint savings, checking, and investment portfolios. Nearly $7 million, gone in a series of rapid transfers. She'd even left me a note, not even bothering to call. "I'm leaving with Marcus. Don't try to find us. By the time you read this, we'll be starting our new life with everything. You've earned, goodbye, everything I'd earned." I almost laughed at her choice of words. Claire had no idea that she'd just proved herself exactly as predictable as I'd anticipated. For the past 18 months, I'd watched her transform from my loving wife of 15 years into a stranger obsessed with her young art dealer lover. Marcus had convinced her he could give her the excitement she craved, a life beyond our boring existence in Switzerland's banking world. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment since I first noticed her changing. You see, in my world of international finance, the first rule is never keep all your assets in one place. The second rule, always have a contingency plan. Claire thought she knew our finances. After all, she'd seen all the accounts, attended the meetings with our Swiss bankers, and helped manage our visible wealth. But she'd forgotten who she was dealing with. Or perhaps she'd never really understood. I picked up my phone and made a call. "Jean-Pierre? Yes, it's time. Initialize Protocol Omega." My old friend and personal banker at a private firm in Zurich didn't need more instruction. We'd set this in motion months ago when I first noticed Claire's late-night phone calls and mysterious weekend art exhibitions with Marcus. Working in international finance for 2 decades teaches you to read people, to notice the subtle shifts that signal someone's intentions before they act. Claire's transformation hadn't been subtle. It started with small things: new clothes from designers I'd never heard of, sudden interests in modern art, and mysterious meetings with her art investment group. She began questioning our lifestyle, calling our lakeside Geneva home provincial, and my work dull. The woman who had once loved our quiet evenings discussing market trends and global investments now craved excitement, adventure, and what she called real passion. I noticed everything, but said nothing. Instead, I watched, documented and prepared. While Claire was falling for Marcus's promises of an exciting new life, I was quietly moving our real wealth, over 40 million in offshore accounts, property holdings, and digital assets, into a labyrinth of trusts and shell companies so complex it would take a team of forensic accountants years to unravel. And that's if they even knew where to start looking. The true irony. Claire had signed off on most of these transfers herself, never bothering to read the documents I occasionally placed in front of her. "I trust you with the financial stuff." "Darling," she'd say, signing papers with a dismissive wave. Each signature further secured my position, legally transferring assets into structures she couldn't touch. My phone buzzed again, another alert. Claire had just tried to access our safety deposit boxes at Credit Suisse. I smiled, picturing her frustration when she found them empty. The contents, including her grandmother's jewels she thought were stored there, had been moved months ago to a private vault facility in Singapore, along with other valuable assets. Standing up, I walked to the window overlooking Lake Geneva. The water sparkled in the morning sun, boats dotting the surface like toys. I thought about Claire and Marcus, probably rushing to the airport now, thinking they'd pulled off the perfect heist. They'd be flying first class, no doubt, celebrating their victory with champagne, planning their new life with what they thought was everything I had. But Claire had forgotten the most important lesson I'd learned in my years managing wealth for the world's elite. True wealth isn't just about money, it's about knowledge, preparation, and patience. While she was falling in love with Marcus's dreams of Mediterranean villas and private jets, I was falling back on decades of experience in protecting and hiding assets across global financial networks. I picked up my phone again, this time to call my lawyer, Heinrich. "They've done it," I said simply. "Begin the proceedings." Heinrich, one of Zurich's top financial attorneys, had already prepared everything. While Claire would be enjoying her first glass of celebration champagne, a team of legal experts would be initiating actions across multiple jurisdictions. The trap wasn't just set, it was already closing. Walking to my private safe, I entered the code and removed a thick folder, labeled Contingency C. Inside was every document needed to prove Claire's infidelity, financial misconduct, and conspiracy to defraud. Bank statements, photographs from private investigators, hotel receipts, and detailed records of her meetings with Marcus over the past year. In Switzerland, infidelity still mattered in divorce proceedings, especially when combined with financial misconduct. But my preparation went beyond just documenting their affair. I'd also compiled a detailed dossier on Marcus himself. Claire's young lover wasn't just an art dealer. He was a known figure in certain financial circles, previously involved in several failed attempts to con wealthy women. His real name wasn't even Marcus, and he had outstanding warrants in 3 countries. Claire had no idea she'd fallen for a professional con man, someone who'd probably been planning to take the money and disappear once they landed. I sat back, down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began monitoring the financial alerts that were now streaming in. Each one represented another failed attempt by Claire to access accounts she didn't know were already far beyond her reach. I didn't feel anger watching these desperate attempts, only a sort of quiet satisfaction in seeing a well-laid plan unfold. Exactly as anticipated, the sun had risen higher over Lake Geneva now, promising another beautiful day in one of the world's most prestigious financial capitals. I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the view, knowing that soon enough I'd be very busy. But for now, I could take a moment to reflect on how Claire's betrayal had actually given me something valuable, the perfect opportunity to demonstrate why I'd become so successful in the world of international finance. Sometimes, the best victories are the ones your opponents don't even know they've lost yet. I spent the next hour watching the digital trail of Claire's desperate attempts to access our wealth spread across my monitoring systems. Each notification told its own story. Credit Suisse, UBS, Julius Baer, she was trying them all. The desperation in her actions was becoming apparent. What amused me most was how she followed exactly the pattern I'd predicted, hitting each bank in the order I'd expected. My phone rang. It was Jean-Pierre from our private bank in Zurich. "Monsieur Laurent, your wife is here right now," he said, in his impeccable French. "She's quite insistent about accessing the secondary holdings." I could hear the subtle humor in his voice. Jean-Pierre had been my confidant for 20 years, managing discreet transactions that would make most bankers nervous. He understood the game we were playing. "Let her try," I replied calmly, "but ensure everything follows protocol." Protocol meant recording every attempt, every demand, every threat she might make. In Switzerland, documentation is everything, and I needed a pristine record for what was coming next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I pulled up the security camera feed from the bank on my laptop. Another precaution I'd arranged months ago. There was Claire, her Hermes scarf slightly askew, gesturing animatedly at the bank staff. Even through the silent footage, I could read her body language. She was playing the role of the concerned wife, probably claiming I was having a mental breakdown or had become unstable. It was a predictable move, one we'd prepared for. Behind her stood Marcus, trying to look sophisticated in his designer suit that I knew he couldn't afford. He kept checking his phone nervously, probably already realizing things weren't going according to plan. What Claire didn't know was that Marcus had already tried this same scheme twice before, once in Monaco and once in Luxembourg, targeting wealthy women with substantial bank accounts. But he'd never tried it in Switzerland, and he'd never targeted someone who specialized in protecting wealth from people exactly like him. My intercom buzzed, security announcing the arrival of Heinrich, my lawyer. I buzzed him up to my home office. Heinrich had been handling private banking disputes for 3 decades, and his reputation in Swiss financial circles was impeccable. He walked in carrying his classic Mont Blanc briefcase, his manner as precise as ever. "Good morning, Alexandra," he said, using my formal name. "I see our friends are making quite a tour of Geneva's banking establishments." He pulled out his iPad, showing me a series of notifications. Claire had already visited 4 major banks and was now on her 5th. Each attempt was being carefully logged, building our case bit by bit. "What's interesting," Heinrich continued, "is that your wife's young friend has quite a colorful history." He pulled up a file showing Marcus's previous identities. Marco Visconti in Monaco, Michel Dupont in Luxembourg. Interpol has been watching him for months. They're quite interested in his sudden appearance in Switzerland. I nodded, taking in the information. "And the offshore structures?" Heinrich allowed himself a small smile. "Completely secure. The series of transfers we executed over the past year are legally impeccable, even if they found the accounts, which they won't. The ownership structure is protected by layers of corporate law across multiple jurisdictions. Singapore, Cayman Islands, Jersey, each layer perfectly legal, perfectly documented. What Claire never understood about wealth of our magnitude was that it wasn't just about money and accounts. It was about structures, legal frameworks, and relationships built over decades. My role, managing investments for select private clients, had taught me every legal method of protecting assets. I'd spent years building a network of trusted bankers, lawyers, and financial experts across every major financial center in the world. I pulled up another screen, showing a live feed of transactions. "Look at this." I pointed to a series of attempts to transfer funds from our known accounts. Claire was trying to move money to various offshore accounts, probably ones Marcus had set up. Each attempt was being blocked, not by me, but by the automatic protocols we'd put in place months ago. "Classic amateur move," Heinrich commented. "Using easily traceable accounts for multiple large transfers. She might as well have sent up flares, announcing their intentions." My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Claire herself. "Alexandra, what have you done? Stop blocking our accounts. You can't keep what's rightfully mine." I showed the message to Heinrich, who immediately added it to his growing file of evidence. In Swiss law, such messages were golden, clear proof of attempted financial misconduct. "Shall we proceed with phase 2? Heinrich asked, pulling out another set of documents. I glanced at the security feed again. Claire and Marcus had left the bank and were now heading toward our lake house, probably hoping to collect the emergency cash Claire thought I kept in the hidden safe behind the Monet in our bedroom. What they'd find instead was an empty safe and a detailed letter from my lawyers, explaining exactly what legal proceedings were about to unfold. "Yes," I replied, "but let's wait until they reach the lake house. Let them understand the full scope of their situation." I picked up my phone and sent a single text to Claire. Bonne chance, good luck. The same thing I used to tell her whenever she embarked on one of her ambitious projects. This time, though, the words carried a different weight. Heinrich began making calls, setting in motion the legal machinery we'd carefully prepared. Within hours, courts across Europe would be processing our filings. Claire's accounts, the ones she could access, would be frozen pending investigation into financial misconduct. Marcus's past would catch up with him as Interpol received anonymous tips about his whereabouts. The net was closing, not with dramatic flair, but with the quiet efficiency of well-executed legal procedure. I turned back to my window, watching boats cruise across Lake Geneva. In the distance, I could see the snow-capped peak of Mont Blanc. Claire used to love this view, back when she appreciated the quiet power of our life here. Before Marcus convinced her that excitement meant more than stability, that passion was worth more than trust. There's one more thing, Heinrich said, pulling out a final document. We've received confirmation that Marcus attempted to access one of his known accounts in Liechtenstein an hour ago. The patterns suggest he's already planning to disappear, probably without Claire. Of course he was. Men like Marcus didn't change. They just found new targets. Claire was about to learn this lesson the hard way, but by then it would be too late for both of them. The wheels of Swiss justice turn slowly, but they turn with remarkable precision. I sat down at my desk, ready for the next phase of our response. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about anger or confrontation. It's about watching your opponents destroy themselves while you simply maintain the high ground. Claire thought she was writing the end of our story. She didn't realize she was just setting up my beginning. While Claire and Marcus made their way to our lake house, I used the time to reflect on how we had arrived at this moment. The trajectory that led to Claire's betrayal wasn't as sudden as it might appear to an outsider. Like most catastrophic failures in both finance and relationships, it had been building for years, with warning signs I had recognized, but chosen to monitor rather than confront directly. I opened my private vault and removed a leather-bound journal I'd maintained for the past 18 months. Inside were meticulous notes on Claire's changing behavior, detailed with dates, times, and specific incidents that had alerted me to the shifting dynamics of our marriage. I began reviewing the entries while waiting for Heinrich to complete his calls. Claire and I had met 20 years ago at a financial conference in London. I was a rising star in wealth management, having just developed an innovative approach to cross-border asset protection that had caught the attention of several major Swiss banks. Claire was working as a financial journalist for a prestigious economic publication, interviewing banking executives about emerging trends in European markets. She was brilliant, ambitious, and possessed a sophisticated understanding of global finance that matched my own. Our conversation over dinner that first evening stretched into the early hours of the morning as we discussed everything from Japanese monetary policy to the future of digital currencies. By the time I returned to Geneva, we were already making plans for her to visit. Within 6 months, Claire had moved to Switzerland, and within a year, we were married in a small ceremony overlooking the lake. She transitioned from journalism to investor relations, working with several private banks in Geneva. We built a life centered around the intellectual challenges of global finance, the cultural sophistication of European society, and the discreet luxury that defined Switzerland's banking elite. For the first decade, our partnership thrived. Claire understood my world and helped me navigate the complex social dynamics of Swiss banking circles. When I launched my own wealth management firm catering to ultra-high net worth individuals, she became my most trusted advisor, helping craft communications for our exclusive clientele. My security feed pinged, showing Claire and Marcus arriving at the lake house. I split my screen to watch while continuing to review my notes. They were moving quickly, Claire leading the way with determined steps, while Marcus looked increasingly anxious, constantly checking over his shoulder. They had no idea they were being recorded from multiple angles, another precaution I'd installed months ago. The first significant entry in my journal dated back to 18 months ago. Claire had returned from an art exhibition in Basel, unusually animated about a collection she'd seen. "The artist understands passion in a way that's so rare now," she'd said, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. I noted how she mentioned the gallery owner, Marcus, with particular interest, describing him as refreshingly different from our usual circles. The next entry, 3 weeks later, documented Claire's sudden interest in contemporary art, something she'd previously dismissed as overpriced nonsense. She began attending exhibitions more frequently, always at galleries associated with Marcus. Her explanations grew more elaborate, her returns home later. I noted a 43% increase in her personal spending, primarily on new clothing from designers she'd never shown interest in before. Heinrich returned to my office, bringing me back to the present moment. "All the legal filings are in motion," he confirmed, "and I've just received word that our contact at Interpol has flagged Marcus's file as priority. They're quite interested in his current whereabouts." On my screen, I could see Claire and Marcus entering the lake house, heading straight for the master bedroom. "Let's see how they react to finding the safe empty," I said, increasing the volume on the security feed. Claire went directly to the Monet, swinging it aside to reveal the wall. Safe. She entered the combination, at least she remembered that correctly, and pulled open the door. Her expression collapsed as she found not the emergency cash she expected, but only a sealed envelope bearing the embossed letterhead of Heinrich's law firm. "It's empty," she said, her voice tight with panic. "There's just this letter." Marcus grabbed the envelope, tearing it open impatiently. As he read, his face transformed from confusion to anger to poorly disguised fear. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, thrusting the letter at Claire. Claire's hands trembled as she read the letter detailing the legal proceedings already in motion. Freezing of accounts, investigation into financial misconduct, notification to banking authorities across Europe, and specific mention of Marcus's previous identities and outstanding warrants. "How could he know all this?" Marcus hissed, pacing the room like a trapped animal. "You said he was oblivious. You said he trusted you completely." Claire looked stunned, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "He did. He always has. I don't understand." "How? Well, he clearly doesn't anymore," Marcus snapped, already pulling out his phone. "We need to move fast. Forget the safe. What about the jewelry? You said there were pieces worth millions." "In the safety deposit boxes at Credit Suisse," Claire replied automatically, then frowned. "But they were empty too. Everything's gone." I watched this exchange with clinical detachment, noting their reactions for future reference. Claire seemed genuinely shocked, while Marcus was already calculating his next move. This aligned perfectly with my assessment of their characters. Heinrich was watching the feed with me, taking notes of his own. "Textbook panic response," he observed. "Notice how quickly he shifted from confidence to contingency planning. This isn't his first time facing exposure." On screen, Marcus was now going through Claire's jewelry box, picking out the few valuable pieces she kept at home. "These will have to do for now," he said, pocketing a pair of diamond earrings I'd given Claire for our 10th anniversary. Claire seemed to be processing the situation more slowly, rereading the letter with growing comprehension. "Alexandre couldn't have known," she muttered, "unless—" Her eyes widened with realization. "Unless he's known all along." My phone buzzed with another text from Claire. "How long have you known? Why didn't you say anything?" I showed the message, and to Heinrich, who nodded. This too would go into our growing file of evidence. I didn't respond immediately, letting the uncertainty work on Claire's mind. In negotiations, strategic silence is often more powerful than words. Heinrich's phone rang, and he stepped aside to take the call. When he returned, his expression was satisfied. Excellent news. The court has granted our emergency petition. All of Claire's known accounts are now officially frozen pending investigation. And there's more. Interpol has just issued an alert for Marcus Rella, also known as Marco, Visconti and Michel Dupont. On my screen, I could see Claire and Marcus arguing now. He was gesturing angrily while she sat with her head in her hands. Their perfect escape plan was unraveling by the minute. I almost felt sorry for Claire. Almost. She had made her choices, with clear intent, believing she could simply take what we had built together and walk away unscathed. I checked the time. It had been less than 3 hours since I'd received the first alert about Claire's attempted transfers. In that short time, their entire plan had collapsed, a house of cards unable to withstand the slightest resistance. This was the difference between their amateur plotting and my years of professional financial strategy. They thought in terms of simple transactions, while I had built an entire system of protection. "Shall I respond to her message?" I asked, Heinrich holding up my phone. He considered for a moment. A brief, factual response would be appropriate, nothing that could be construed as threatening or vindictive. I nodded and typed, "I've known since Basel. The accounts were protected. Long before that, we should communicate through our lawyers from now on." On screen, Claire's phone chimed. She read my message, her face draining of color. She showed it to Marcus, whose response was immediate and predictable. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Claire called after him, panic evident in her voice. "To make some calls," he snapped. "Stay here, I need to figure out how to fix this." But we both knew he wasn't making calls. He was running, abandoning Claire, just as I had predicted he would. The moment things got difficult, men like Marcus always disappeared, moving on to easier targets. Claire had just become a liability. Heinrich closed his briefcase with a satisfying click. "I believe our work here is done for today. The legal process will take its course now." He paused, studying me carefully. "Are you certain you want to proceed with all aspects of our plan? There is still time to show mercy." I considered his question seriously. Part of me, the part that remembered 20 years of partnership with Claire, hesitated. But then I recalled the coldness in her message that morning, the calculation behind her betrayal, the ease with which she had attempted to dismantle my life. "Proceed as planned," I confirmed. "Full implementation of all measures." Heinrich nodded once and departed, leaving me alone with the security feeds. On screen, Claire sat motionless on our bed, staring at the open safe as though waiting for answers to appear. Marcus had already driven away, his sleek Italian sports and car speeding toward the Swiss border. I closed my journal and returned it to the vault. The first phase of my response was complete. Now we would enter the more complex terrain of legal proceedings, financial reconstruction, and whatever desperate counter-moves Claire might attempt. I wasn't worried. After all, in chess, the player who thinks 5 moves ahead always has the advantage. With Heinrich gone and the immediate legal measures in motion, I had a moment to gather my thoughts. The view from my office overlooked the pristine waters of Lake Geneva, a sight that had always brought me clarity during challenging situations. I'd built my career on anticipating financial storms before they hit, and my personal life was no different. I unlocked a hidden drawer in my desk and withdrew. Another file, this one containing photographs and reports from the private investigation firm I'd engaged 10 months ago. The sleek black folder was labeled simply Dossier M, for Marcus, of course. I hadn't looked at these materials for weeks, having already committed most of their contents to memory, but now they served as a stark reminder of how methodically Claire's betrayal had unfolded. The first report dated back to a Tuesday evening in April of last year. Claire had told me she was meeting with a women's investment group, but the photographs showed her having dinner with Marcus at La Réserve, one of Geneva's most exclusive restaurants. They weren't being particularly discreet, sitting on the terrace, champagne on the table, his hand occasionally touching hers. Their body language spoke volumes. This wasn't their first meeting. The investigators' notes were detailed and dispassionate. Subject arrived at restaurant at 19:45, appeared nervous, checking surroundings frequently. Male companion arrived at 19:52, greeted subject with kisses. On both cheeks, lingering contact. Conversation appeared intense, with subject leaning forward, engaged. Dinner lasted until 23:10, followed by walk along lakefront. Subjects observed embracing at 23:47 before departing in separate vehicles. I remembered that night clearly. Claire had returned home just after midnight, flushed with excitement she attributed to a fascinating discussion about emerging markets. I had nodded, asked a few questions about the supposed investment group, and watched her construct elaborate lies with growing confidence. I had kissed her goodnight, while the scent of another man's cologne still clung faintly to her clothes. My security feed pinged again, drawing my attention back to the present. Claire was leaving the lake house, her movements frantic as she threw clothing and essentials into a suitcase. Her phone was pressed to her ear, and though the audio wasn't clear enough to catch every word, her desperation was evident. She was calling Marcus, who wasn't answering, already abandoned, though she hadn't fully realized it yet. I toggled to another feed, showing the main roads leading from our property. Marcus's Maserati was already approaching the highway toward the French border. He was running, exactly as predicted. Men like Marcus didn't stand their ground when cornered. They disappeared, reinvented themselves, and found new targets. Claire had just become yesterday's mistake in his mind. My intercom buzzed. Security announcing the arrival of Sophia, my chief financial strategist. I had asked her to come the moment Claire's transfers were detected, knowing we'd need to initiate certain financial countermeasures immediately. Sophia entered my office with her characteristic efficiency, tablet in hand and ready for action. A former quant trader with an uncanny ability to see patterns in financial chaos, she had become my most valued professional ally over the past decade. "The situation is unfolding exactly as you anticipated, Alex," she began, using the informal name preferred among my inner circle. "Claire has attempted access to 17 different accounts across 8 institutions, all attempts blocked or tracked per protocol." She swiped through screens on her tablet, showing me real-time data on the financial maneuvers. "The interesting part is where the money was headed." She pulled up a diagram showing the intended flow of funds. Not just one destination, but 5 separate accounts across 3 jurisdictions: Cayman Islands, Belize, and curiously Malta. The Malta account particularly stands out. It was established just 3 weeks ago under a shell company with connections to previous entities linked to Marcus's other aliases. I studied the diagram with interest. He was planning to divert the funds from their shared accounts. Sophia nodded. Classic exit strategy. The transfer patterns suggest he was going to leave Claire with only about 20% of the stolen funds while securing the bulk for himself. The Malta account was set up to automatically transfer to yet another account in Cyprus after 48 hours, effectively making the money impossible to trace further. This confirmed what I'd already suspected. Marcus had never intended a genuine partnership with Claire. She was merely a means to access wealth, a tool to be discarded once she served her purpose. There was a certain poetic justice in the fact that both of them had been planning betrayals, each underestimating their opponent. "How are the secondary protective measures holding?" I asked. Sophia swiped to another screen. "Flawlessly. The tiered security protocols you established have kept all primary assets completely isolated from these attempts. More importantly, our algorithmic monitoring has documented every attempt with timestamps and digital fingerprints. The evidence trail is impeccable." And the offshore structures? Completely secure. The Cayman and Singapore holdings remain untouched, and the digital asset portfolio has been transferred to cold storage as instructed. She paused, a slight smile crossing her face. I must say, the design of your protective framework is impressively comprehensive. Claire couldn't have accessed the real holdings, even if she had spent years trying. I nodded, satisfied but not surprised. The structures we had created weren't just about hiding wealth. They were about creating legitimate, defensible asset protection that could withstand both legal scrutiny and unauthorized access attempts. This wasn't the shadowy world of questionable tax havens that amateurs imagined. This was sophisticated financial architecture built on a foundation of international law and treaties. My phone chimed with an alert from the banking security system. Claire had just arrived at Pictet Bank in downtown Geneva, making yet another desperate attempt to access accounts. This time, however, something was different. She was alone. She's moving systematically through our known banking relationships, I noted, showing Sophia the alert. But Marcus has already abandoned her. Sophia studied the notification. Interesting. She's requested a meeting with Roland Bergeron. He's the managing director. This was unexpected. Roland was indeed a senior executive at Pictet, but he wasn't our primary contact there. In fact, I couldn't recall ever mentioning his name to Claire. Check Marcus's background again, I instructed Sophia. Any previous connections to Bergeron or Pictet Bank? While Sophia worked, I received another notification, this one from my contact at the Swiss Border Patrol. Marcus's vehicle had been flagged crossing into France at Ferney-Voltaire, the closest border crossing to Geneva. He was officially out of Switzerland now, but his troubles were only beginning. French authorities had been notified of the financial crime investigation, and his vehicle would be tracked through their automated systems. Here it is, Sophia said, looking up from her tablet. Roland Bergeron was involved in a significant art financing deal 3 years ago in Monaco. The gallery owner involved was listed as Marco Visconti, one of Marcus's aliases. The connection was clear now. Claire wasn't just making random attempts, she was following a contingency plan that Marcus had likely shared with her, a plan that involved leveraging his previous relationship with Bergeron. But what she didn't know was that such connections worked both ways. If Bergeron recognized Marcus's name from previous dealings, he might also be aware of the man's questionable reputation. I picked up my phone and dialed Jean-Pierre at our primary bank. I need you to contact Roland Bergeron at Pictet immediately, I instructed. Inform him that my wife is currently in his office, attempting to access accounts under false pretenses, and that there's an active investigation into financial crimes, involving her companion, Marcus Rella, also known as Marco Visconti. Jean-Pierre understood immediately. Consider it done. Bergeron and I serve on the Banking Association Ethics Committee together. He'll handle this appropriately. I ended the call and turned back to Sophia. Let's proceed with the next phase. Begin the consolidation process for all secondary holdings and activate the contingency fund for the legal proceedings. She nodded and began implementing the instructions, her fingers moving rapidly across her tablet. These were measures we had prepared months ago. A comprehensive plan to reorganize my financial holdings in the event of exactly this type of situation. While Claire was running from bank to bank, finding doors closed at every turn, we were systematically reinforcing the structures that protected the true wealth she had never fully understood. My security feed showed Claire leaving Pictet Bank, her expression a mixture of frustration and fear. She stood on the steps for a moment, frantically trying to call someone, Marcus again presumably, before hailing a taxi. Where would she go next? Her options were rapidly diminishing. The comfortable life she had taken for granted, the social standing she had enjoyed as my wife, the financial security she had never had to worry about, All of it was evaporating by the hour. The calm, methodical progression of my counterplan hit its first significant obstacle that evening. I was reviewing documentation with Sophia when my private line rang, a number only a handful of people possessed. It was Isabel, Claire's younger sister. "Alexandre," she began without preamble, her voice sharp with accusation. "What have you done to my sister? She's absolutely distraught, saying you've frozen everything and are threatening her with criminal charges. This isn't like you." I put the call on speaker so Sophia could hear, giving her a subtle nod to continue documenting everything. Isabel had always been close to Claire, but unlike her sister, she had a background in corporate law before shifting to humanitarian work. She wasn't someone to underestimate. "Hello, Isabel," I replied calmly. "I understand you're concerned, but I think there are aspects of the situation Claire may have omitted in her version of events. Such as..." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. "Such as her emptying our joint accounts this morning. Such as her explicit message informing me she was leaving with her lover. Such as the documented financial misconduct that triggered automatic security protocols across our accounts." I kept my tone matter-of-fact, devoid of the emotion Isabel was clearly hoping to provoke. There was a pause on the line. She mentioned withdrawing funds, but said it was her share, money she was entitled to after years of marriage. She said, "You've hidden everything else." I had expected this. Claire would naturally present herself as the victim to her family, counting on their emotional support without revealing the full extent of her actions. It was time to recalibrate the narrative. "Isabel, given your legal background, you understand that there are proper channels for dividing marital assets. They don't include emptying joint accounts without notice and attempting to transfer funds to offshore accounts connected to a man with multiple fraud investigations pending against him." Another pause, longer this time. When Isabel spoke again, her tone had shifted from accusation to cautious concern. "What are you talking about? What fraud investigations?" "I'm referring to Claire's companion, who has operated under at least 3 different identities in the past 5 years, targeting wealthy individuals across Europe. There are active Interpol notices regarding his activities." I nodded to Sophia, who pulled up the relevant documentation and sent a carefully redacted version to Isabel's email. "I've just sent you some information you might find illuminating. It's a matter of public record." I heard the soft ping of an email notification through the phone, followed by the sound of Isabel opening the attachment. The silence stretched as she reviewed the documents. Official Interpol notices for Marcus under his various aliases, news reports about similar cases in Monaco and Luxembourg, and financial trace evidence showing the pattern of his previous operations. "Claire can't know about this," Isabel finally said, her voice quieter now. "She wouldn't get involved with someone like this knowingly." "I believe that's a conversation you should have with your sister," I replied, careful to maintain neutral ground. "My concern is protecting the assets that have been put at risk through these actions." "Where is she now?" Isabel asked, professional instinct seemingly taking over from sisterly defense. "When we last spoke, she was making attempts to access various accounts across Geneva's banking institutions. She's likely finding those attempts unsuccessful." I chose not to mention that I was actively tracking Claire's movements through security systems. Some details were better kept private even in this conversation. Sophia handed me a note. "Claire now at Hotel d'Angleterre, checked in alone 20 minutes ago." "Isabel, I understand your concern for your sister, but this situation has legal and financial dimensions that can't be dismissed. I've engaged counsel to handle matters properly, and I suggest Claire do the same rather than continuing her current approach." "And if she doesn't have access to funds for proper legal representation?" "What then, Alexandra? You hold all the cards. There was a note of her earlier accusation returning. This was the challenge I had anticipated, the perception that I was using financial superiority to overwhelm Claire. It needed to be addressed carefully. "That's not accurate," I replied. "Swiss law ensures that both parties have access to appropriate legal representation in divorce proceedings. Furthermore, the court can authorize reasonable living expenses from marital assets during the legal process. What the law doesn't permit is the unilateral emptying of accounts or the removal of assets from the jurisdiction, precisely what Claire attempted this morning." I could almost hear Isabel's legal mind processing this information, weighing it against whatever emotional appeal Claire had made to her. "I'll speak with Claire," she finally said. "But Alexandra, if I find you've manipulated this situation or are using your banking connections to exert undue pressure—" "I understand your concern," I interrupted gently. "I'm simply following proper legal and financial protocols. Nothing more, nothing less." After Isabel hung up, Sophia looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "That was the first challenge, but hardly the last. Claire comes from a prominent family. They won't stand by while their daughter is implicated in financial misconduct, even with evidence." She was right. The Valmont family had been fixtures in Geneva society for generations. Claire's father, though retired, still maintained connections throughout the Swiss banking world. He had initially been skeptical about his daughter marrying a self-made financial strategist like me, rather than someone from their established social circles. While we had developed a respectful relationship over the years, I harbored no illusions about where his loyalties would ultimately lie. "We need to prepare for their intervention," I acknowledged. "Claire will present herself as a victim, manipulated by both Marcus and me in different ways. Her family will likely support this narrative." "What's our counter-strategy?" Sophia asked, already making notes. "Transparency and process," I replied. "We don't respond emotionally or punitively. We simply adhere to financial regulations and legal requirements, documenting everything meticulously." My security tablet chimed with another alert. Claire had received a visitor at her hotel, a distinguished older gentleman I recognized as Philippe Valmont, her father. The family mobilization was beginning faster than I'd anticipated. Sophia noticed my expression. "Her father?" I nodded, revealing the first genuine complication in my carefully constructed plan. Philippe wasn't just Claire's father. He was also a former board member at several major Swiss banks and had served on regulatory committees during his career. His influence couldn't be underestimated. "We need to accelerate certain measures," I decided, turning to my computer. "Move the Singapore holdings into the secondary protection framework immediately, and contact Heinrich. We need to file the complete financial disclosure with the court tonight, not tomorrow." Sophia nodded and began implementing these instructions while I pulled up another secure communications channel. This one connecting me to Dieter Hoffmann, the current banking commissioner for the Geneva region, and more importantly, someone who had benefited significantly from my investment guidance over the years. "Dieter," I began when he answered, "I apologize for the late call, but I wanted to alert you personally to a situation that may reach your office soon." I explained the essentials of Claire's actions, Marcus's background, and the protective measures that had been activated. "I'm concerned that certain parties may attempt to exercise influence to override standard banking protocols in this matter." Dieter understood immediately. "You're suggesting Philippe Valmont might intervene on his daughter's behalf." "It's a possibility I must consider," I acknowledged. "Alexandra, you know I respect your financial acumen and appreciate our relationship, but I cannot interfere with standard banking procedures or investigations," Dieter replied, his tone formal, but not unfriendly. I'm not asking for interference, I clarified. Quite the opposite. I'm asking that the standard procedures be followed precisely, regardless of who might request exceptions or special consideration. There was a pause as Dieter considered this. That is a reasonable request. I'll ensure that any matters related to this situation are handled according to protocol, without deviation. After ending the call, I felt reasonably confident that at least the banking side of the equation would remain stable. The legal proceedings might prove more challenging, especially if the Valmont family engaged their considerable resources. My security feed showed Claire and her father in deep conversation in her hotel suite. Philippe's expression was grave, while Claire appeared to be alternating between distress and animated explanation. I couldn't hear their words, but the body language told a clear story. She was pleading her case, and he was taking it seriously. Another alert pinged, this one from the border control monitoring system. Marcus's vehicle had been flagged at a toll station near Lyon, continuing south through France. He was running, but not toward any of his known previous haunts. This was a new pattern, suggesting he might have established yet another identity and escape route that hadn't been uncovered in our investigation. Sophia, I called, alert Interpol that Marcus appears to be heading toward Marseille or possibly continuing to Spain. His pattern doesn't match previous escapes to Monaco or Italy. As she made the call, I received another notification, this one from my banking alert system. Someone was attempting to access, not our regular accounts, but one of the secondary-level offshore structures in Singapore. This was concerning. Those accounts weren't publicly linked to our known holdings. Someone with specialized knowledge was probing my defenses. I pulled up the access logs, studying the digital fingerprints of the attempt. It wasn't Claire. The approach was too sophisticated, using techniques that suggested professional experience in financial systems. But it wasn't Marcus either. His methods were documented in our intelligence files, and this didn't match his pattern. We have a third player, I informed Sophia as she finished her call. Someone's attempting access to the Singapore structure using advanced methods. The approach suggests professional financial expertise. Sophia moved quickly to my side, studying the logs. The attempt originated from a private server in Geneva, routed through multiple proxies. This isn't amateur work. I nodded, a new theory forming. Philippe Valmont may have engaged outside expertise. He knows people in digital forensic banking, specialists who can trace financial architectures that normal investigators would miss. This was the first genuine threat to my protective framework. While Claire and Marcus had been predictable in their approaches, a professional forensic banking team could potentially identify and untangle the complex structures I'd established. They wouldn't find anything illegal. I had been scrupulous about maintaining legitimate documented transfers, but they might locate assets Claire didn't previously know existed. Implement Contingency Protocol Delta, I instructed Sophia. Full obfuscation of the tertiary structures and immediate dispersion of the Singapore holdings across the distributed framework. The attempted probe into my Singapore holdings represented a significant escalation. Whoever Philippe Valmont had engaged, and I was increasingly certain he was behind this, possessed sophisticated capabilities that required an equally sophisticated response. Contingency Protocol Delta wasn't just a defensive measure, it was a complete reconfiguration of my asset protection architecture. Initiate the full protocol sequence, I instructed Sophia as I moved to my primary secure workstation. I'll handle the authorization codes personally, while Sophia coordinated with our network of trustees and financial managers across different jurisdictions. I began the complex process of authenticating the transfers and structural changes. This wasn't simply moving money from one place to another. It was activating a distributed ownership framework that had been established years ago precisely for situations like this. The system required biometric verification, encryption keys, stored on separate devices, and confirmation codes from trusted associates in Singapore, Zurich, and London. I had designed it this way intentionally, ensuring that no single person, not even me, could unilaterally control or access the full extent of the assets without proper authentication and oversight. As I worked through the verification sequences, my mind drifted back to when I had first conceptualized this system. It was shortly after a concerning conversation with Claire 3 years ago, one that had planted the first seeds of doubt about our shared future. We had been at a charity gala in Monaco, surrounded by Europe's financial elite. Claire had been unusually distant that evening, spending more time networking with other guests than engaging with our hosts or me. Later, in our hotel suite, she had asked an unexpected question. "Alexandre, if something happened to you, would I be able to access all our assets, or are there holdings I don't know about?" Her tone had been casual, but the question itself was pointed in a way that caught my attention. "Everything is properly documented," I had replied carefully. "Why do you ask?" She had shrugged, removing her diamond earrings at the vanity. "Camille Dufour's husband died suddenly last month. Apparently he had investments she knew nothing about, and now she's struggling with Swiss banking secrecy laws to access what should rightfully be hers. It just made me wonder." It was a reasonable explanation, but something in her delivery had felt rehearsed. Camille Dufour was barely an acquaintance, certainly not someone Claire had ever expressed concern about before. The question seemed designed to probe my financial arrangements rather than express genuine concern. That night I had lain awake after Claire had fallen asleep, reviewing our relationship through a new lens. The next morning, I began designing what would eventually become the multi-tiered asset protection framework that Sophia and I were now activating in its final form. My security tablet chimed, pulling me back to the present. Claire and her father had left the hotel and were now heading toward the offices of Bertrand and Castel, one of Geneva's most prestigious law firms specializing in high-net-worth divorce proceedings. The Valmonts were mobilizing their considerable resources more quickly than I had anticipated. "The distributed protocol is fully activated," Sophia reported, returning to my side. "Singapore holdings are now dispersed across 17 separate structures, each with independent verification requirements and management oversight. The digital trail has been obfuscated through legitimate financial instruments that would require court orders in 7 different jurisdictions to fully trace." I nodded, satisfied with the implementation. "And the probe attempts?" "Continuing, but hitting significantly more complex barriers now. They've shifted tactics twice already, suggesting they're adapting to our countermeasures. Whoever Philippe engaged knows what they're doing. This was concerning, but not unexpected. The Swiss financial world was small at its highest levels, and Philippe had connections throughout the private banking sector. He could have engaged any number of specialized forensic financial firms to analyze my holdings and identify potential vulnerabilities. My phone rang. It was Heinrich, responding to my earlier message about accelerating our filings. "The complete financial disclosure has been submitted to the court," he confirmed. "Judge Mercier has been assigned to the case. She's known for her meticulous approach to financial matters. This was a neutral development. Judge Elise Mercier had a reputation for strict adherence to banking regulations and divorce law, favoring neither wealthy husbands nor sympathetic wives. She would follow the evidence and applicable statutes without being swayed by the Valmont family name or my financial position." "There's more," Heinrich continued. "Bertrand and Castel have already filed an emergency petition for temporary access to marital assets, claiming financial duress and undue hardship. They're requesting a hearing tomorrow morning." This was the first countermove from Claire's team, attempting to regain access to funds while the larger case proceeded. It was a standard tactic, but the speed suggested they had been preparing this approach even before Claire's attempted transfers this morning. "Who's representing her?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Marguerite Bertrand herself," Heinrich confirmed, naming the formidable founding partner of the firm. Bertrand was a legend in Swiss family law, known for securing exceptional settlements for her clients, particularly women married to wealthy financiers. "They're not holding back," I noted. "Prepare a comprehensive response to the emergency petition. Emphasize the attempted unauthorized transfers and the connection to Marcus. Include the Interpol notices, but be careful not to appear vindictive. We want to position this as protective rather than punitive." After ending the call with Heinrich, I turned back to Sophia. "We need to accelerate our financial intelligence gathering. If Philippe has engaged professionals to probe our structures, we need to identify exactly who we're dealing with." Sophia nodded. "I'll activate our contacts at the Swiss Banking Association. If someone is running sophisticated financial forensics in Geneva, they'll have registered their systems with the regulatory framework." As she made those arrangements, I received another alert from our monitoring systems. Marcus's vehicle had diverted from the southern route, now heading west toward the Spanish border. This deviation from his previous pattern was noteworthy. He wasn't following any of the escape routes we had predicted based on his past behavior. "He's improvising," I murmured, studying the tracking data. Something spooked him. Perhaps most interesting was that he hadn't attempted any contact with Claire since abandoning her hours ago. Typical patterns for financial criminals like Marcus included maintaining contact with their primary target long enough to secure additional assets or information, even after the initial scheme began unraveling. His complete severing of communication suggested something had changed his risk calculation. My secure messaging system pinged with an encrypted communication from Jean-Pierre at our primary bank. "Alert! Major inquiry received regarding your secondary holdings from Aegis Financial Intelligence, requesting verification of Brazilian and Cayman structures. Referred to regulatory compliance as per protocol. Thought you should know. Aegis Financial Intelligence, one of the premier forensic banking firms in Europe, known for their work with regulatory authorities and their unparalleled expertise in tracing complex financial structures." This confirmed my suspicions about Philippe engaging top-tier assistance. The mention of Brazilian holdings was particularly concerning. Those structures were not publicly linked to my known assets in any way. "Sophia," I called, "we have confirmation. Philippe has engaged Aegis. They're already identifying connections to the Brazilian frameworks." She looked up sharply. "The Brazilian holdings aren't publicly documented. They could only know about those through specialized intelligence channels." "Precisely," I agreed. "Someone with insider knowledge of my financial architecture is providing information. We need to identify the source immediately." The list of people with comprehensive knowledge of my complete financial structure was extremely limited. Myself, Sophia, Jean-Pierre, and 2 trusted attorneys who had helped establish the framework. One of them was feeding information to Philippe or directly to Aegis. I pulled up the secure communication logs for the past month, searching for any unusual patterns or unauthorized access attempts. Nothing immediately stood out, but that didn't mean the leak wasn't there. Someone with proper authorization wouldn't trigger security protocols. "Check the access logs for all senior partners at our legal and financial firms," I instructed Sophia. "Look for unusual timing, irregular query patterns, or excessive documentation downloads." While she began that analysis, my attention returned to the more immediate concern. Tomorrow's emergency hearing regarding Claire's petition for asset access. If Judge Mercier granted her request, it could provide a foothold for more extensive claims against the visible portion of our marital assets. I opened a secure channel to Heinrich again. "We need to create a reasonable compromise position for tomorrow's hearing," I told him when he answered. "Something that appears generous while maintaining the protective framework we've established." Heinrich considered this for a moment. "What do you have in mind?" "Propose immediate access to a managed account with sufficient funds for 3 months of living expenses at her current standard, plus a reasonable retainer for legal representation," I suggested. "Structure it as a good faith gesture while emphasizing the need for proper accounting of the funds she already attempted to transfer." "Reasonable, but not overly generous," Heinrich noted. "It positions you as responsive to legitimate needs while maintaining appropriate caution given the circumstances. Judge Mercier might find this balanced approach appealing." After finalizing these arrangements, I turned my attention back to the tracking data on Marcus. His vehicle had stopped at a small hotel near the Spanish border, presumably for the night. I instructed our intelligence team to notify local authorities of his presence, providing them with the relevant Interpol notices. While my primary focus was protecting my assets from Claire and her family's legal maneuvers, I hadn't forgotten the man who had helped orchestrate this betrayal. My security feed showed Claire returning to her hotel, now accompanied by a woman I recognized as Marguerite Bertrand. They were deep in conversation, Bertrand gesturing emphatically while Claire nodded. The renowned attorney was clearly preparing her client for tomorrow's hearing, coaching her on presentation and responses. Sophia returned with preliminary findings from her analysis of access logs. "Nothing conclusive yet, but there's an interesting pattern with one of the junior partners at Waldstein and Meyer," she reported, referring to one of our European legal firms. "Thomas Keller has accessed documentation related to the Brazilian structures 3 times in the past month, which is unusual, given his primary focus on European holdings. This was potentially significant. Keller wasn't senior enough to have comprehensive knowledge of my financial architecture, but he might have gleaned enough from his access to specific documents to provide valuable intelligence to someone looking for entry points. Continue monitoring his access patterns," I instructed, "but don't alert anyone at the firm yet. If he's our leak, I want to understand the full extent of what he's compromised before taking action." As evening settled over Geneva, I took a moment to pour myself a glass of Macallan 25, a ritual that helped me think more clearly during complex situations. The amber liquid caught the light as I considered the chessboard that had formed around Claire's betrayal and my response. Claire and her family had mobilized impressive resources, legal, financial, and intelligence, more quickly than I had anticipated. Their approach suggested they had been preparing for this contingency for some time, perhaps as part of Claire's broader exit strategy with Marcus. This wasn't an impulsive action, but a calculated move with significant planning behind it. Yet, despite their preparations, they were still operating with incomplete information. They were probing blindly for assets they suspected existed, but couldn't fully identify or locate. Their approach reminded me of a quote from my early mentor in financial strategy. "In wealth preservation, what you don't know exists can't be targeted." Tomorrow would bring the first real confrontation in this unfolding drama, a courtroom rather than a battlefield, but no less strategic for that difference. As I sipped my whiskey, I felt not anxiety, but a curious sense of clarity. Claire had initiated this conflict believing she held the advantage. She was about to discover just how mistaken that assumption had been. The Geneva Cantonal Court building stood as a monument to Swiss precision and tradition, its neoclassical architecture projecting an aura of impartial justice. I arrived early for the emergency hearing, preferring to be settled in the courtroom before Claire and her legal team made their entrance. Heinrich walked beside me, his leather briefcase containing meticulously organized documentation of everything that had transpired over the past 36 hours. Judge Mercier reviewed our financial disclosure filing this morning, Heinrich informed me as we climbed the marble steps. Her clerk requested additional information about the attempted transfers, which we provided. This suggests she's taking the financial misconduct aspect seriously. And Claire's petition? I asked, nodding to the security personnel as we passed through the screening area. Standard format for emergency relief, but with some interesting assertions, Heinrich replied. They're claiming you've engaged in financial hostage-taking by freezing all accounts, preventing Claire from accessing even basic living expenses or legal representation funds. They've painted a rather dramatic picture of Claire stranded at a hotel with no resources. I nodded, having expected this approach. Despite the fact that she attempted to empty our accounts just yesterday morning and still has access to her personal credit cards, which remain active. Precisely. We've documented those facts in our response, along with records showing she made several significant purchases yesterday afternoon, including a 5,000 franc transaction at Bucareb, en Rue du Rhône. This detail was particularly telling. Claire had purchased luxury items, even while claiming financial distress. The transaction had been flagged by our monitoring systems, showing that while she claimed to be financially stranded, she had still found resources for high-end shopping. We entered courtroom 3, a space designed with the understated elegance typical of Swiss institutions. Mahogany paneling, discreet lighting, and comfortable but not ostentatious seating created an atmosphere of serious deliberation rather than theatrical confrontation. I took my place at the respondent's table, Heinrich arranging his materials. With practiced precision, 10 minutes later the door opened again, and Claire entered with her attorney, Marguerite Bertrand. Claire had chosen her appearance carefully. A conservative navy suit that projected seriousness without appearing extravagant, minimal jewelry, and subtle makeup that emphasized her natural beauty while suggesting vulnerability. It was a calculated, visual statement, one that said wronged wife rather than financial conspirator. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom. I maintained a neutral expression, but Claire quickly looked away, leaning to whisper something to Bertrand. The attorney, a silver-haired woman in her 60s whose reputation for ferocity in financial disputes was legendary, nodded calmly, patting Claire's hand in a gesture of reassurance. Behind them came Philippe Valmont, Claire's father. He had aged since I'd last seen him at a family dinner 3 months ago, the stress of the situation evident in the tightness around his eyes. He gave me a cold, appraising look before taking a seat directly behind his daughter. The message was clear. The full weight of the Valmont family stood behind Claire. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Elise Mercier entered. In her mid-50s, with sharp eyes behind rimless glasses and a reputation for cutting through emotional arguments to focus on financial facts, she was neither an ally nor an adversary, simply a neutral arbiter who would follow Swiss banking and family law to the letter. "Good morning," she began, her voice crisp and efficient. "We're here to address an emergency petition for temporary access to marital assets filed by Claire Valmont Laurent against Alexandre Laurent. I've reviewed the initial filings from both parties. Before we proceed, I want to be clear that this hearing is narrowly focused on the question of temporary access to living expenses and legal representation funds. The broader issues of asset division, financial misconduct allegations, and divorce proceedings will be addressed in due course." She turned first to Bertrand. "Counsel, you may present your client's petition." Marguerite Bertrand rose with the confidence of an attorney who had stood in this position hundreds of times before. "Thank you, Your Honor. My client, Mrs. Laurent, finds herself in an untenable position. Yesterday morning, following the discovery of her husband's infidelity—" "Objection," Heinrich interjected smoothly. Counsel is presenting unsubstantiated allegations not relevant to the narrow focus of this hearing. Judge Mercier nodded. Sustained. Ms. Bertrand, please confine your arguments to the financial access issues before us today. Bertrand adjusted. Seamlessly. Of course, Your Honor. Following a breakdown in the marital relationship, my client attempted to secure her fair share of marital assets. Assets to which she is legally entitled after 15 years of marriage. In response, Mr. Laurent activated a pre-planned financial strategy designed to cut off my client from all marital resources. Every account she has attempted to access has been frozen or emptied. She has been effectively left without means to secure appropriate housing, basic living expenses, or adequate legal representation to protect her interests. I watched Claire as Bertrand spoke, noting how she kept her eyes downcast, occasionally dabbing at them with a tissue, a performance of distress that I knew from experience didn't match her actual emotional responses to stress. Claire's true tell when genuinely upset was to become more animated, not withdrawn. This demure display was calculated for the judge's benefit. Bertrand continued, Mr. Laurent is a sophisticated financial strategist who has deployed his expertise to create an insurmountable disadvantage for my client. We are simply asking that Mrs. Laurent be granted immediate access to sufficient funds for 3 months of living expenses at her accustomed standard, plus adequate resources for proper legal representation. This is not only reasonable, but required by the principle of equal access to justice. It was a compelling presentation, succinct, reasonable in its requests, and carefully framed to avoid the complications of Claire's own actions. Bertrand was earning her substantial fee. Judge Mercier turned to our table. Mr. Keller, your response? Heinrich rose, his manner as composed as Bertrand's, but with a different energy. Less theatrical, more focused on factual precision. Your Honor, we appreciate the court's attention to this matter and have no objection to Mrs. Laurent receiving appropriate interim support. However, there are critical facts that must be considered in determining what is truly appropriate in this situation. He activated the courtroom's display system, projecting the first of our prepared exhibits. Yesterday morning at 6:42 a.m., Mrs. Laurent initiated transfers totaling 6.83 million Swiss francs from joint accounts, effectively attempting to empty them completely. These transfers were accompanied by this message to my client. The screen displayed Claire's original message. I'm leaving with Marcus. Don't try to find us. By the time you read this, we'll be starting our new life with everything you've earned. Goodbye. A small but audible gasp came from somewhere in the courtroom. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Bertrand remained impassive, but I noticed her hand tightened slightly on her pen. Heinrich continued methodically. These attempted transfers weren't to established accounts in Mrs. Laurent's name, but to newly created offshore structures with connections to this individual. The display changed to show Marcus's photograph alongside his Interpol notice. Marcus Rella, also known as Marco Visconti and Michel Dupont, currently the subject of multiple fraud investigations across Europe. Judge Mercier studied the documentation with focused attention. And the response to these transfer attempts? The transfers triggered automated security protocols designed to protect against unauthorized withdrawals or potential fraud, standard practices in high-net-worth banking relationships, Heinrich explained. These protocols temporarily restricted access to the accounts pending verification and investigation, as is standard procedure under Swiss banking regulations. He displayed another exhibit, a screenshot of Claire's credit card transactions from yesterday afternoon. Despite claims of financial distress, Mrs. Laurent made several substantial discretionary purchases yesterday, including this 5,247 franc transaction at Bucherer Jewelers. Her personal credit cards remain active and fully functional. Bertrand. rose immediately. Your Honor, these purchases were necessary replacements for items Mrs. Laurent left behind when she was effectively forced to leave the marital home. Judge Mercier raised a hand. I'll consider that explanation, Ms. Bertrand. She turned back to Heinrich. Please continue. Given these circumstances, Mr. Laurent proposes the following reasonable accommodation, Heinrich said, displaying our prepared offer. Immediate establishment of a managed account with 75,000 Swiss francs for 3 months of living expenses, plus 150,000 francs designated specifically for legal representation to be paid directly to counsel's client trust account. This accommodates Mrs. Laurent's legitimate needs while acknowledging the concerning nature of her recent financial actions. It was a carefully calibrated offer, generous enough to appear reasonable while maintaining appropriate restrictions given Claire's demonstrated behavior. More importantly, it positioned me as responsive to legitimate needs rather than vindictively. Withholding resources. Judge Mercier studied the proposal, then looked at Bertrand. Counsel, your response to this offer? Bertrand didn't miss a beat. While we appreciate that Mr. Laurent has finally acknowledged his obligation to provide support, the proposed amounts are wholly inadequate given the Laurent's standard of living and the complexity of the financial issues involved. Mrs. Laurent requires at minimum 50,000 francs monthly for living expenses and at least 500,000 francs for initial legal representation, given Mr. Laurent's sophisticated financial structures. The numbers were deliberately inflated. Even during our marriage, Claire's personal monthly expenses rarely exceeded 30,000 francs. And even the most complex financial divorce cases in Switzerland typically required initial retainers of 200,000 to 300,000 francs. Judge Mercier removed her glasses, a gesture I'd heard signaled she was preparing to render a decision. I've reviewed the filings and heard arguments from both sides. This situation presents several concerning elements. She turned first to Bertrand and Claire. Mrs. Laurent, while you are certainly entitled to appropriate support during these proceedings, your actions in attempting to transfer substantial sums without notice or proper legal process are troubling. Such actions suggest precisely the kind of financial misconduct that emergency freezes are designed to prevent. Claire visibly tensed, her carefully constructed expression of vulnerability slipping for a moment. Bertrand placed a hand on her arm, steadying her. Judge Mercier continued, However, Mr. Laurent, regardless of these circumstances, your wife is entitled to appropriate interim support and the means to secure adequate representation. The court will not permit financial advantages to determine legal outcomes. She replaced her glasses and referred to her notes. My ruling is as follows. Mr. Laurent will establish a managed account with 40,000 Swiss francs monthly for Mrs. Laurent's living. Expenses for the next 3 months, subject to review thereafter. Additionally, he will provide 250,000 francs for initial legal representation to be paid directly to counsel's trust account. She looked up, fixing both parties with a firm gaze. Furthermore, I am ordering a complete forensic accounting of all marital assets to be conducted by an independent firm appointed by the court. Both parties will provide full cooperation and disclosure. Any attempt to conceal assets or transfer funds outside the jurisdiction during these proceedings will result in significant sanctions. With that, she closed her folder. The court will issue a formal written order by the end of business today. We are adjourned. As the judge exited, I exchanged a brief glance with Heinrich. The ruling represented both a victory and a setback. The support amounts were reasonable, falling between our offer and Bertrand's demand. More concerning was the order for independent forensic accounting, which would inevitably complicate the protection of my offshore holdings. Across the courtroom, Claire and Bertrand were huddled in conversation with Philippe. Claire's expression had hardened, the vulnerable facade abandoned now that the judge was gone. When she looked up and caught me watching, Her eyes narrowed, with a cold determination that confirmed what I already knew. This was only the first skirmish in what would be a protracted campaign. The courtroom outcome required immediate strategic adjustments. While Judge Mercier's ruling on financial support was reasonable, her order for independent forensic accounting presented a significant complication. Heinrich and I discussed next steps as we left the courthouse, careful to maintain sufficient distance from Claire and her entourage. The court will likely appoint Deloitte or KPMG for the forensic review, Heinrich noted as we descended the courthouse steps. They'll begin with the visible assets and trace outward, looking for inconsistencies or unusual patterns. How extensive will their authority be? I asked, already calculating which structures might come under scrutiny. Significant, but not unlimited. They'll have access to Swiss accounts automatically and can request international cooperation for accounts in jurisdictions with reciprocal agreements. However, they'll need specific evidence and court orders to access more complex structures, particularly in jurisdictions with stronger privacy protections. This confirmed what I had suspected. The forensic accounting would identify certain offshore holdings, but not the full architecture. The challenge would be managing what was discovered to prevent it from leading to the more sophisticated structures. We should prepare for the first layer to be exposed, I decided as we reached my waiting car. Let's ensure those holdings are properly documented and defensible. Heinrich nodded. I'll begin compiling the necessary supporting documentation. But Alexandra, we should discuss how far you want to take this. At some point, continued resistance could be more costly than a reasonable settlement. Let's see what Claire's next move is before we make that determination, I replied, watching as Claire, Bertrand, and Philippe emerged from the courthouse across the plaza. Even from this distance, I could read the body language. Philippe talking intently, Bertrand nodding with cool professional confidence, and Claire's posture suggesting a mixture of vindication and determination. After Heinrich departed for his office, I directed my driver to take me not to my home or office, but to a modest apartment building in Geneva's Paquis district. Few people knew about this secondary residence, purchased through a separate holding company years ago. It served as both a secure retreat and a private workspace, for matters requiring absolute discretion. The apartment was spartanly furnished, but equipped with state-of-the-art security and communication systems. I activated the encrypted network and contacted Sophia, who had been monitoring developments remotely. The court appointed forensic accountants, I informed her, when her image appeared on the secure display. We need to prepare the first-tier offshore structures for scrutiny. Sophia nodded, unsurprised. Already in progress. I've initiated documentation protocols for the Cayman and Singapore holdings most likely to be identified. The question is, how to handle the Brazilian connection. That's the potential thread that could lead to the deeper architecture. She was right. The Brazilian holdings represented a vulnerability not because they were improperly established, they weren't, but because they served as a transition point between the visible financial landscape and the more sophisticated structures beyond. What's the status on identifying our information leak? I asked, changing focus to this critical issue. We've narrowed it down, Sophia replied, pulling up data on her screen. Thomas Keller at Waldstein and Meyer definitely accessed the Brazilian documentation. Inappropriately, but there's an interesting twist. He didn't access it for himself. He was responding to a request from Maurice Fontaine. This was unexpected. Maurice Fontaine was a senior partner at the firm, someone who had worked with me for over a decade and whom I considered trustworthy. Do we have verification of this connection? Email correspondence between them, plus Keller's access logs, correlate precisely with the timing of Fontaine's requests. Here's where it gets interesting. Fontaine had dinner with Philippe Valmont 3 weeks ago at Le Richemont. One of our financial intelligence associates spotted them and thought it unusual enough to report, given their lack of previous social connection. The pieces were falling into place. Philippe had been gathering intelligence and preparing for this situation well before Claire made her move. Fontaine's betrayal was particularly concerning. He had direct knowledge of several key offshore structures from his work on their establishment. Activate containment protocols for any structures Fontaine has knowledge of, I instructed, and prepare contingencies in case he has shared information we don't yet know about. While Sophia began implementing these measures, I turned my attention to another pressing matter, Marcus's ongoing flight. The tracking data showed his vehicle had crossed into Spain early that morning, heading south toward Barcelona. But something about his movement pattern seemed odd, almost erratic, with unnecessary detours and doubling back. Pull up the complete tracking log for Marcus's vehicle, I requested. Sophia displayed the data, showing the car's movement since leaving Geneva. It's like he's searching for something, I observed, studying the pattern. Or trying to lose someone. Or testing whether he's being followed, Sophia suggested. These movement patterns are consistent with counter-surveillance techniques. This suggested a level of sophistication beyond what our intelligence on Marcus had indicated. Either he was more experienced in evasion than we thought, or he had assistance. I considered the implications. Check flight manifests from Barcelona for the next 48 hours, I requested. Focus on destinations with limited extradition agreements with European authorities. While Sophia conducted this search, my attention was drawn to a notification from our banking security system. Someone had attempted to access one of my personal accounts at Julius Baer. Not Claire this time, but a different digital signature altogether. We have another probe attempt, I noted, showing Sophia the alert. Different approach than the previous ones. This one seems more targeted, focusing on my personal accounts rather than our joint holdings or the offshore structures. Sophia analyzed. The digital fingerprint. This doesn't match Aegis's known methodologies. It's someone else, possibly an individual rather than a firm. I considered the implications. Claire or Philippe may have engaged multiple resources, attacking from different angles. Or, Sophia suggested carefully, there's another player we haven't identified yet. This possibility had been lingering at the edges of my thinking. The situation with Claire and Marcus had seemed straightforward at first. A wife leaving with a younger man, attempting to secure finances before disappearing. But the rapid mobilization of sophisticated resources, the multiple angles of financial probing, and now Marcus's unusually professional evasion techniques suggested something more complex might be unfolding. We need to look deeper into Marcus's background, I decided. Not just his previous identities and scams, but possible connections to larger networks or organizations. As Sophia began this research, I received a call from Jean-Pierre at our primary bank. His tone was unusually urgent. Alexandra, there's something you should know immediately. Philippe Valmont just left a meeting with Anton Kuznetsov. The name sent a chill through me. Anton Kuznetsov was a Russian financier with whom I had a complicated history. 5 years earlier, I had identified inconsistencies in a major investment proposal he had presented to several Swiss banks, effectively preventing him from establishing certain financial structures in Switzerland. While my analysis had been strictly professional, Kuznetsov had taken it as a personal affront, publicly declaring that I had undermined his reputation out of competitive jealousy. "Are you certain?" I asked, though I knew Jean-Pierre wouldn't have mentioned it without verification. Absolutely. They met at Kuznetsov's suite at the Four Seasons. My contact on the hotel staff confirmed they were together for nearly 2 hours. This connection changed the dynamic significantly. If Kuznetsov was involved, the situation had evolved beyond a simple divorce with financial complications. He had both the resources and the motivation to use Claire's betrayal as a vehicle for something more targeted. We need to reassess everything. In light of this connection, I told Sophia after ending the call with Jean-Pierre. Kuznetsov's involvement suggests this may have been orchestrated as more than just Claire leaving with a younger man. He may have identified Marcus and facilitated their connection specifically to create this opportunity. It was a concerning theory, but fit the facts better than our initial understanding. Kuznetsov had the financial intelligence capabilities to identify someone like Marcus, track my marital situation, and potentially even engineer the chance meeting between Claire and Marcus at the Basel art exhibition. That would explain the sophistication of the financial probes, Sophia agreed, and possibly Marcus's evasion techniques as well, if he's actually working with or for Kuznetsov rather than simply being Claire's lover. Then Claire herself may not understand the full scope of what she's involved in. I finished the thought. She may believe this is simply about leaving me for another man and taking what she considers her fair share, when in reality she's being used as a tool in Kuznetsov's longer game. This realization required a fundamental shift in strategy. What I had been treating as a divorce with financial complications now needed to be approached as a potential coordinated attack on my complete financial architecture, using Claire as the initial point of leverage. I pulled up our secure database containing background information on Kuznetsov's known operations and associates. Check if Marcus has any connection to these individuals or entities, I instructed Sophia, sending her the list. Even tangential relationships could be significant. While she began this analysis, I received another notification, this one from our monitoring of Claire's communications. She had just made a phone call from her hotel room to an unlisted number. The call had lasted only 37 seconds, but the number traced back to a burner phone purchased in cash in Geneva 2 days ago. Claire's making contact through channels she thinks are secure, I noted. That suggests she's aware of at least some level of surveillance and is taking countermeasures. Should we activate the enhanced monitoring protocols? Sophia asked, referring to the more invasive surveillance capabilities we had available but had so far refrained from using. I considered this carefully. While those capabilities would provide more comprehensive intelligence, they also carried greater legal and ethical implications. Not yet. Let's continue with our current monitoring level, but increase alertness for anomalous patterns. The afternoon progressed with a steady flow of information and developments requiring assessment and response. Our research team identified preliminary connections between one of Marcus's previous aliases and a gallery in Monaco that had received financing from a subsidiary of a holding company linked to Kuznetsov. It wasn't definitive proof of a direct relationship, but it established a plausible connection worth investigating further. Meanwhile, the court-appointed forensic accounting team had been officially named, a joint team from Deloitte and BDO, Switzerland, led by Dr. Martina Weber, a respected financial investigator known for her work on complex international cases. They would begin their review the following morning, with preliminary findings expected within 2 weeks. As evening approached, I received word that Claire had checked out of her hotel and moved to her father's estate in Cologny, one of Geneva's most exclusive areas. This wasn't surprising. The Valmont family compound offered both security and privacy that a hotel couldn't provide. It also suggested Claire was settling in for a prolonged conflict rather than planning to leave the jurisdiction. My secure phone rang, Heinrich, with an update from his sources within the legal community. Bertrand is preparing a much more aggressive filing, he informed me. They're going to allege systematic financial concealment and request extraordinary discovery measures, including compelling testimony from your financial associates in multiple jurisdictions. Based on what evidence? I asked. They're citing reasonable suspicion of systematic offshore structuring and the preliminary findings from their financial consultants. It's a fishing expedition, but if granted, it could significantly complicate Our protective measures. This was a standard tactic in high-net-worth divorces, using the legal discovery process to force disclosure of financial information that couldn't be obtained through normal banking channels. It was also exactly the kind of approach Kuznetsov would recommend, leveraging the Swiss legal system's methodical processes against me. Prepare a comprehensive response, I instructed Heinrich. Focus on Claire's own financial misconduct, as demonstrated by her attempted transfers, and emphasize that the court-appointed forensic team is already conducting an appropriate review. After ending the call, I sat back in my chair, taking a moment to consider the rapidly evolving situation. What had begun as Claire's betrayal was revealing itself to be potentially part of a much more complex design, with layers of motivation and strategy that went beyond a simple marital breakdown. The question now was how to respond to this expanded threat landscape without sacrificing my legitimate protections. Claire, Philippe, Bertrand, and possibly Kuznetsov were all moving pieces on this chessboard, each with their own objectives and approaches. Navigating this successfully would require not just financial acumen, but strategic foresight and precise timing. One thing was increasingly clear. I wasn't just fighting to protect my assets from a vengeful spouse. I was defending against what appeared to be a coordinated attempt to dismantle the financial architecture I had spent decades building. The stakes had just risen considerably. Morning brought the first tangible confirmation of Kuznetsov's involvement. Sophia arrived at my private apartment with intelligence that altered our understanding of the entire situation. "We've identified the connection," she announced, projecting a complex relationship diagram onto the wall display. "Marcus Reller isn't just a random conman who targeted Claire. He's worked for Kuznetsov before, in a very specific capacity." The diagram showed a series of relationships linking Marcus, under his various aliases, to several wealthy women across Europe over the past 7 years. In each case, the woman had been married to someone in the financial sector who had previous dealings with Kuznetsov. "He's a specialist," I observed, studying the pattern. "Kuznetsov uses him to target the wives of financial professionals who have crossed him." Sophia nodded. "Exactly, and the pattern is consistent. Marcus establishes contact, develops a relationship over 6 to 12 months, then facilitates a dramatic exit designed to create maximum financial disruption for the target, you, in this case. This revelation crystallized everything. Claire hadn't simply fallen for a younger man. She had been specifically targeted as part of a sophisticated revenge operation orchestrated by Kuznetsov. The financial chaos wasn't a side effect, it was the primary objective. "But there's more," Sophia continued, highlighting a particular section of the diagram. "In 3 previous cases, after the initial disruption, the targeted financial professional experienced a systematic attack on their banking relationships and client base. In one case, a private banker in Luxembourg lost 80% of his clients within 6 months after his wife left with a man matching Marcus's description. This was the true danger, not just the potential loss of assets in a divorce settlement, but a calculated attack on my professional standing and client relationships. Kuznetsov was using Claire and the divorce as the first phase of a more comprehensive campaign. "We need to warn Claire," I said, surprising even myself with the statement. Sophia looked equally surprised. "Warn her? About what specifically?" "That she's being used as a pawn in Kuznetsov's game. Whatever her feelings about our marriage, she deserves to know she's being manipulated as part of a larger strategy." "And you think she'll believe you?" Sophia asked skeptically. "More importantly, do you think warning her serves our strategic interests?" It was a fair question. Claire had made her choices, including attempting to empty our accounts. Her willingness to betray me so completely suggested she might not be receptive to warnings about Kuznetsov's manipulation. "It's not about whether she believes me," I replied after consideration. "It's about ensuring we've provided the information. If she chooses to ignore it, that's her decision. But tactically, having made the attempt gives us leverage if the manipulation becomes relevant in legal proceedings." Sophia nodded, understanding the dual purpose, a genuine warning combined with strategic positioning. "How do you want to approach this? Direct contact would be unwise given the legal situation." "Through Isabel," I decided. "Claire's sister has legal training and enough distance from the emotional dynamics to potentially evaluate the information objectively." While Sophia prepared a carefully curated information package for Isabel, I turned my attention to the court-appointed forensic accounting process that was beginning today. Dr. Weber had requested an initial interview to establish parameters and expectations. "Dr. Weber is thorough but fair," Heinrich advised when I consulted him about the approach. "Be transparently cooperative regarding the visible assets, provide clear documentation for the first-tier offshore holdings, and maintain a professional demeanor." She's not easily impressed by financial complexity or legal maneuvering. The meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. at Deloitte's Geneva offices. I arrived precisely on time, dressed in a conservative suit that projected competence without ostentation. Dr. Weber greeted me with a firm handshake and direct gaze that assessed more than welcomed. "Mr. Laurent, thank you for making time for this meeting," she began, once we were seated in her meticulously organized office. "I want to be clear about the process and my approach. The court has directed a comprehensive review of all marital assets. This isn't an adversarial exercise. My team isn't working for either party, but for the accurate accounting of financial facts." I nodded. "I understand completely, Dr. Weber. Financial clarity serves everyone's interests." She gave me a look that suggested she'd heard similar statements from countless financially sophisticated individuals attempting to appear cooperative while concealing assets. "Then let me be specific about what we'll need. Complete access to all financial records for accounts and holdings within Switzerland, detailed documentation for any international holdings, verification of all transfers exceeding 1 million francs over the past 5 years, and a comprehensive declaration of any structures, trusts, or entities in which you hold beneficial interest." "Of course," I replied, maintaining my composed demeanor. "My team has prepared an initial documentation package." I handed her a sealed portfolio containing records of the visible Swiss holdings and the first tier of offshore structures, precisely what we had anticipated would be discoverable through normal forensic methods. Dr. Weber accepted the portfolio without opening it. "This is a start, but I should be clear. In my experience, initial disclosures are rarely complete. My team will conduct independent verification through banking channels, international cooperation agreements, and sophisticated analytical methods. Discrepancies tend to emerge." Her direct approach was refreshing in its honesty. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Dr. Weber. Thoroughness serves the interests of justice." "Indeed," she replied, studying me with clinical detachment. "One more thing, Mr. Laurent. The court has granted us authority to interview third parties with knowledge of your financial affairs, including bankers, attorneys, and financial managers across multiple jurisdictions. We'll be exercising that authority extensively." This was a calculated warning, letting me know that relationships and structures I might believe were secure could be exposed through human intelligence rather than just financial records. It was a standard tactic, but effectively delivered. "My financial affairs are complex, but legitimate," I responded. "I welcome thorough examination." Dr. Weber's slight nod acknowledged the chess move without conceding anything. We'll begin formal interviews tomorrow. Please ensure your financial team is available and prepared. After leaving Deloitte's offices, I received an urgent call from Jean-Pierre. Alexandre, there's an unusual development. Kuznetsov just requested a meeting with me. This was unexpected. Did he say what about? Only that it concerns mutual interests regarding the Laurent situation. He was deliberately vague, but implied he has a proposition that would benefit the bank. This was a classic Kuznetsov approach, attempting to create division between me and my banking relationships, by suggesting he could offer something advantageous. When is the meeting? He proposed this afternoon. I haven't agreed yet. I considered the implications. Declining would simply lead Kuznetsov to approach someone else at the bank, while accepting might provide valuable intelligence about his strategy. Take the meeting, but ensure it's recorded per compliance protocols. Don't commit to anything, just listen and report back. Upon returning to my secure apartment, I found Sophia reviewing new intelligence with obvious concern. "We have a problem," she announced. "Marcus has disappeared." "What do you mean, disappeared?" "We had tracking on his vehicle. The car was found abandoned at a parking facility near Barcelona airport. No record of him on any commercial flights, but there was private jet activity to Cyprus yesterday, a known transit point for destinations with limited extradition agreements. This development was concerning. If Marcus had truly escaped the jurisdiction, it suggested both sophisticated resources and advanced planning. What about his digital trail? Phone, credit cards, email? Nothing since yesterday afternoon. It's as if he's gone completely dark or shifted to prepared alternate identities. This level of evasion requires significant support. Kuznetsov, I concluded. He's extracting his asset now that the initial disruption has been created. While we were processing this information, I received confirmation that our package had been delivered to Isabel. The carefully prepared dossier included evidence of Marcus's previous operations for Kuznetsov, documentation of the pattern of targeting wives of financial professionals, and specific warnings about the likely next phases of the operation. Hours passed without response, leading me to wonder if Isabel had dismissed the information or perhaps shared it with Claire, who had convinced her it was manipulation on my part. Then just after 5 p.m, a message arrived from an encrypted channel we hadn't anticipated. "Need to meet, alone, information important, place of our first conversation in Geneva, 8 p.m. tonight." Isabel wanted to meet at the small cafe where I had first been introduced to her 16 years ago, shortly after beginning my relationship with Claire. It was a public location, but intimate enough for private conversation, a carefully chosen neutral ground. "It could be a trap," Sophia warned when I showed her the message. "Claire or her legal team could be setting up a situation to compromise you." It was a valid concern. Meeting Isabel alone, outside the formal legal channels now established, carried risk, but it also presented an opportunity to gain insight into Claire's perspective and potentially establish a back channel for resolution. "I'll take precautions," I assured Sophia. "Have our security team conduct advanced surveillance of the location, monitor for unusual activity, and maintain digital recording of any conversation for legal protection." Jean-Pierre called with a report from his meeting with Kuznetsov. "It was exactly as expected," he informed me. He suggested the bank might want to reconsider its relationship priorities, given the unfortunate public attention your situation might generate. Then he implied that shifting certain client relationships to his associated financial services firm would ensure stability. This was a standard pressure tactic, attempting to leverage the potential for scandal to undermine banking relationships. "And your response?" I asked. "That the bank has complete confidence in your integrity and the legitimacy of all accounts under our management," Jean-Pierre replied with professional satisfaction. I also reminded him that attempts to interfere with established banking relationships could potentially violate Swiss banking regulations. Well handled, I acknowledged. Did he reveal anything about his broader strategy? Nothing explicit, but he mentioned something interesting as he was leaving. He said, "It's not just about the money, you know. Some things are more valuable than accounts." This cryptic statement required analysis. Kuznetsov wasn't known for philosophical observations. His comments typically contained specific meaning. What do you think he was referring to? My instinct, says client relationships, Jean-Pierre suggested, or perhaps reputation in the financial community. These are the true currencies in our world, more valuable than specific accounts. He was right. In Swiss banking, trust and reputation were the foundation of everything. Financial assets could be protected through legal and structural means, but reputation damage could be more difficult to defend against, especially when orchestrated by someone with Kuznetsov's resources and connections. As evening approached, I prepared for my meeting with Isabel. Security confirmed the cafe location was clear, with no unusual activity detected. I dressed casually but appropriately for the venue, ensuring I wouldn't attract undue attention. Before leaving, I received a final update from Sophia on our ongoing investigations. The financial intelligence team had identified additional connections between Kuznetsov and previous cases involving Marcus. In each situation, the pattern extended beyond the initial marital disruption to include systematic reputation attacks against the targeted financial professional. He uses the divorce as cover for the real operation, Sophia explained. The public focuses on the marital drama, the younger lover, the emptied accounts, the scandalous details. Meanwhile, Kuznetsov quietly undermines professional relationships and reputation through more subtle means. By the time the target realizes what's happening, significant damage has been done. This insight confirmed my growing suspicion that the divorce proceedings, while costly and emotionally charged, were merely the visible portion of a more comprehensive strategy. Claire was both a participant and a pawn, perhaps not fully understanding the larger game she had joined. As I prepared to leave for my meeting with Isabel, I considered what approach would be most effective. Direct accusations against Kuznetsov might seem defensive or paranoid. Attempts to win Isabel as an ally against Claire would likely backfire given their sisterly loyalty. The most productive approach would be factual presentation, followed by thoughtful questions, allowing Isabel to draw her own conclusions rather than forcing a perspective. The evening air was cool as I walked the final block to the cafe, deliberately, arriving 10 minutes early to secure an appropriate table and observe Isabel's arrival. The quaint establishment had changed little over the years, still offering the perfect balance of privacy and public accessibility that made it ideal for delicate conversations. I selected a corner table with good sightlines to both the entrance and the street, ordered an espresso, and waited to see what information Isabel considered important enough to risk this unconventional meeting. Isabel arrived precisely at 8, her manner cautious as she scanned the cafe before approaching my table. She had always been the more analytical of the Valmont sisters. Where Claire carried herself with practiced charm, Isabel projected intellectual intensity. Tonight, she seemed particularly guarded, sitting down without removing her coat. "Thank you for coming," she began without preamble. "I received your dossier." "And?" I prompted when she didn't immediately continue. She placed her handbag on the table, positioning it carefully between us. "I'm recording this conversation for my protection," she stated matter-of-factly. "I assume you're doing the same." I nodded, appreciating her directness. "I am. Legal prudence requires it." With that understanding established, she reached into her bag and removed a slim folder. "I've reviewed your claims about Marcus Reller and Anton Kuznetsov. While initially skeptical, I conducted my own verification. She pushed the folder toward me. These are additional connections I've identified between them. 3 more cases fitting the same pattern. This was unexpected. Isabel had not only taken the information seriously, but had extended the investigation independently. I opened the folder to find meticulously documented cases from Frankfurt, Milan, and Vienna, each involving a financial professional whose wife had left with a man matching Marcus's description, followed by systematic professional disruption. "You're thorough," I acknowledged, genuinely impressed. "Before I went into humanitarian law, I specialized in financial intelligence," she reminded me. "These skills don't disappear." I studied the new cases, noting the consistent methodology. "Have you shared this with Claire?" Isabel's expression tightened. I attempted to. She refused to look at the evidence, accused me of taking your side, and suggested I was betraying family loyalty. She leaned forward slightly, which brings me to why I wanted this meeting. I need to understand what's really happening, Alexandra. Not the legal posturing or financial maneuvering, the actual situation. This presented a critical opportunity to establish an alliance with someone in Claire's inner circle, someone with both the intelligence to understand the larger game and potentially the influence to reach Claire. The actual situation is precisely what these files suggest, I replied calmly. Claire wasn't randomly seduced by a younger man. She was targeted as part of a sophisticated operation orchestrated by Kuznetsov, aimed ultimately at undermining my professional standing and client relationships. The divorce chaos is just the visible part of a more comprehensive strategy. Isabel watched me carefully, assessing both my words and demeanor. "And you believe Claire is unaware of this larger context, that she's being manipulated rather than actively participating?" It was the central question, whether Claire was victim or conspirator. "I believe she was initially unaware," I answered honestly. "Whether she's now knowingly participating is harder to determine. Her refusal to consider the evidence you presented suggests either deep emotional commitment to Marcus or awareness that questioning his background would undermine her current position." "There's something else you should know," Isabel said, after a thoughtful pause. 3 days ago, Claire received a call that clearly upset her. She took it privately, but I overheard fragments, something about changing terms and not what we agreed. Afterward, she was agitated, making multiple calls that went unanswered. This was significant, potentially indicating that Claire was experiencing her own complications with whoever was orchestrating events from behind the scenes. "Marcus has disappeared," I informed Isabel. "His last known location was Barcelona Airport, but he's gone completely dark. No digital trail, no financial activity." Isabel absorbed this information with a slight frown. "Claire doesn't know. She's been trying to contact him repeatedly, becoming increasingly frustrated with his silence." This confirmed my suspicion that Claire wasn't fully privy to the larger operation. She was being used as an instrument, valuable for her initial role in creating financial disruption, but perhaps not trusted with knowledge of the broader strategy. "There's something else," Isabel continued, lowering her voice slightly. "Philippe, our father, has been acting strangely, having private meetings, taking calls in his study behind closed doors. He's brought in financial consultants I've never seen before, people who don't align with his usual conservative approach. This aligned with our intelligence about Philippe engaging Aegis Financial Intelligence and potentially coordinating with Kuznetsov." "Has he mentioned Kuznetsov specifically?" I asked. "Not to me," Isabel replied. "But yesterday I overheard him telling Claire that Anton's people had identified additional assets that would change the equation significantly. I assumed at the time he meant the forensic accountants. But given what I now know, the pieces were aligning more clearly. Philippe had indeed established a working relationship with Kuznetsov, believing he was simply gaining powerful assistance for his daughter's divorce. He likely didn't realize he was being manipulated as part of a larger strategy targeting me. "What's your objective in sharing this information?" I asked directly. Isabel was too strategic to be acting purely from concern. She met my gaze directly. "Claire is my sister. Whatever issues existed in your marriage, I don't believe she understood what she was getting involved with. I'm concerned she's now caught between powerful forces without fully grasping the dangers, and you want me to—" I left the question open. "Find a way to resolve this that doesn't destroy her," Isabel answered simply. "She made poor choices, yes, but being manipulated by people like Kuznetsov carries consequences beyond financial settlements and legal maneuvers." It was a reasonable concern. Kuznetsov wasn't known for sentimentality toward his tools once they'd served their purpose. If Claire was becoming a complication rather than an asset in his operation, her position could become precarious. "I'm open to resolution paths that protect both our interests," I said carefully. "But Claire would need to be willing to consider the actual situation rather than the narrative she's currently invested in." Isabel nodded. "I'll continue trying to reach her, but she's deeply entrenched in her position. The fact that Marcus has disappeared without explanation may create an opening for reconsideration, especially if she begins to question other aspects of what she's been told." We spoke for another 30 minutes, exchanging information and perspectives on the evolving situation. Isabel proved to be both insightful and pragmatic, bringing valuable intelligence from within Claire's circle while maintaining appropriate boundaries regarding legal matters. Before departing, she made one final request. "If you identify genuine threats to Claire's well-being beyond financial or legal complications, I expect to be informed immediately." I agreed without hesitation. Whatever the state of my marriage to Claire, basic human decency demanded protection from genuine harm. Additionally, establishing this channel with Isabel created a valuable resource for potential resolution pathways as the situation evolved. After Isabel left, I remained at the cafe for another 20 minutes, considering the strategic implications of this new alliance and information. The picture was becoming clearer. Claire had been manipulated into creating the initial financial disruption. Philippe had been brought in to provide respectability and additional pressure through his banking connections, and now Marcus had been extracted, his role complete. The next phase of Kuznetsov's operation would likely focus on reputation damage and client relationship disruption, attacks that would be harder to defend against than the financial maneuvers. I needed to strengthen my position accordingly. Upon returning to my secure apartment, I initiated a series of resource development measures with Sophia and our extended team. First, we established an enhanced monitoring system for all client communications, designed to identify potential approach attempts from Kuznetsov's network. Next, we prepared individualized briefings for key clients, framing the current situation in terms that maintained confidence while appropriately contextualizing any rumors they might hear. "We should also activate our media management protocols," Sophia suggested. "Kuznetsov typically uses carefully placed stories to undermine reputation. Having relationships with key financial journalists will help us identify and counter these efforts." I agreed, authorizing outreach to trusted media contacts who understood the nuances of the financial world and could recognize manipulation attempts. While I had always maintained a relatively low public profile, the coming weeks would likely require more active management of media narratives. The most critical resource development, however, involved our intelligence-gathering capabilities. Understanding Kuznetsov's next moves would require deep visibility into his operations and networks. Expand our financial intelligence team, I instructed Sophia. Bring in the specialized analysts we've used for due diligence on complex transactions. I want comprehensive monitoring of any financial entities or individuals connected to Kuznetsov, particularly focusing on unusual transactions or relationship building with my clients or partners. As these measures were initiated, Jean-Pierre called with concerning news from our primary bank. The board received an unusual communication today, he reported. A detailed analysis suggesting that continued association with your management firm represents elevated reputational risk given recent developments. Let me guess, I replied grimly. The analysis came without clear attribution, but contained sophisticated financial modeling and risk assessment. Precisely, Jean-Pierre confirmed. The document was professionally produced, with just enough legitimate concerns to demand serious consideration. The board has requested a formal response and risk mitigation plan by the end of the week. This was classic Kuznetsov methodology, using apparently objective analysis to plant seeds of doubt within institutional relationships. The timing wasn't coincidental. It aligned perfectly with the forensic accounting process beginning and Claire's legal team preparing more aggressive filings. We'll prepare a comprehensive response, I assured Jean-Pierre. In the meantime, could you discreetly determine whether similar communications have been received by other institutions where we maintain relationships? The systematic development of defenses against this multifaceted attack would require not just financial acumen, but strategic coordination across legal, communication, intelligence, and relationship management domains. As I worked late into the night with my team, I reflected on how quickly the situation had evolved from what had initially appeared to be a painful but straightforward divorce into a complex campaign requiring full deployment of the resources I had developed throughout my career. The offshore millions that Claire had forgotten about weren't just financial assets. They represented the infrastructure of protection and response capability that would now be fully activated. Kuznetsov had initiated this campaign believing he could systematically dismantle what I had built. He was about to discover the true depth and resilience of those structures. The morning brought the first genuine surprise in what had otherwise been a methodical chess match. I was reviewing intelligence reports with Sophia when Heinrich called. With news that defied our carefully constructed predictions. Claire has fired Bertrand, he announced without preamble. She's replaced her entire legal team. This was unexpected. Marguerite Bertrand was among the most respected divorce attorneys in Switzerland, particularly skilled in high-net-worth cases. Replacing her mid-process suggested either serious strategic disagreement or external pressure. Who's representing her now? I asked, signaling Sophia to begin researching immediately. That's the truly interesting part, Heinrich replied, his tone suggesting professional concern. She's engaged Weber, Schmidt, and Moreau. The name registered immediately. Weber, Schmidt, and Moreau wasn't a family law firm. They specialized in complex financial restructuring and regulatory defense. More significantly, they had represented Kuznetsov in his previous dealings with Swiss banking authorities. This confirms Kuznetsov's direct involvement, I noted, watching as Sophia pulled up the firm's background on her tablet. But it's an unusual choice for divorce proceedings. Their expertise doesn't align with Claire's apparent objectives. Precisely, Heinrich agreed. Unless her objectives have shifted, the firm has requested an immediate case management conference with the judge citing significant new information that necessitates recalibration of proceedings. After ending the call, I turned to Sophia. This is a strategic pivot. Claire isn't simply pursuing divorce and asset division anymore. Kuznetsov is redirecting the approach towards something more aligned with his broader objectives. The timing coincides with Marcus's disappearance, Sophia observed, connecting events. Perhaps Claire is now more directly under Kuznetsov's influence, without Marcus as an intermediary. Before we could develop this theory further, my secure phone rang with an unlisted number. Somewhat to my surprise, it was Isabel. Claire came home late last night after meeting with new attorneys, she reported, her voice tense. She seemed different, more focused, less emotional. She spent hours in Father's study reviewing documents, then made several calls speaking in technical financial terms I've never heard her use before. This behavioral shift was concerning. Has she mentioned Marcus? That's what's strangest, Isabel replied. She hasn't tried to contact him today at all. When I asked about him, she dismissed the question entirely, saying he was no longer relevant to the situation. After the call with Isabel, I convened an emergency strategy session with my core team, Sophia, Heinrich, Jean-Pierre, and two specialized financial intelligence analysts who'd been monitoring Kuznetsov's known operations. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at my private office space with enhanced security protocols in place. We're facing a significant strategic shift, I began, outlining what we knew. Claire has replaced her legal team with Kuznetsov's representatives. Marcus has disappeared from the equation, and Claire's approach has transformed from emotional to technically sophisticated overnight. Jean-Pierre spoke first. The bank has received a formal request for detailed transaction histories going back 5 years, focusing specifically on client-related transfers and fee structures. It's ostensibly from the court-appointed forensic team, but the specificity suggests targeted intelligence gathering rather than standard divorce discovery. This confirmed my growing theory. Kuznetsov isn't primarily interested in Claire getting a favorable divorce settlement. He's using the legal proceedings to gain access to sensitive financial information, client relationships, transaction patterns, fee structures, information that would be valuable for competitive intelligence or regulatory manipulation. Heinrich nodded grimly. The legal angle makes sense now. Weber, Schmidt and Moreau are specialists in using regulatory frameworks to compel disclosure of information that would otherwise be protected by banking secrecy provisions. They're using divorce proceedings as a vehicle to access intelligence about your financial operations. The true nature of Kuznetsov's strategy was becoming clear. Claire had been useful in creating the initial disruption, but her real value was as a legal vehicle for accessing protected information. As the wronged spouse in a high-profile divorce, she could compel disclosure of financial details that Kuznetsov could never access directly. We need to recalibrate our approach, I decided. Instead of treating this as a divorce with financial complications, we need to recognize it as a sophisticated intelligence operation using divorce proceedings as cover. Sophia was already adapting our response plan. I'll implement enhanced protection protocols for all client-related information. We should also prepare for direct approaches to clients from Kuznetsov's network, likely framing them as concerned financial advisors warning about instability in your management structures. As the team developed countermeasures, my secure phone rang again, this time with a call I hadn't anticipated. It was Dr. Weber, the court-appointed forensic accountant. Mr. Laurent, she began formally, I'm calling to inform you that my team has received an unusual communication. A dossier was delivered to our offices this morning containing what appears to be detailed information about offshore structures allegedly connected to your financial holdings, along with allegations of improper client fee arrangements. This was a bold move, attempting to manipulate the neutral forensic investigation by planting information. Did this dossier include attribution or sourcing? I asked. No, which is precisely why I'm calling you directly, Dr. Weber replied, her tone professionally neutral. As an independent investigator, I'm obligated to examine all relevant information, but I'm equally obligated to maintain procedural integrity. Anonymous submissions suggesting investigative directions raise obvious concerns about potential manipulation. I appreciated her approach, acknowledging the information while recognizing the potential for bias. I understand completely. I'm happy to address any specific questions arising from this material through proper channels. I've also contacted Mrs. Laurent's new legal team to express similar procedural concerns, Dr. Weber added. Their response was noteworthy. They suggested that the information's origin was less important than its content, and implied that failure to pursue these specific allegations might indicate bias in the forensic process. This was consistent with Kuznetsov's typical tactics, applying subtle pressure while creating situations where professionals would feel compelled to pursue his preferred investigative directions to avoid accusations of impropriety. I trust your professional judgment. Dr. Weber, I replied carefully. My team and I remain available to provide any legitimate information required for your work. After ending the call, I shared this development with the strategy team. Kuznetsov is attempting to manipulate the forensic investigation, likely to focus attention on specific areas while diverting it from others. It's a calculated risk, Heinrich noted. If Dr. Weber perceives this as inappropriate interference, it could backfire. She's known for her independence. True, but it creates pressure and potentially plants seeds of suspicion that influence the investigation's direction. I countered. Even professionals as experienced as Dr. Weber can be subtly affected by information they've been exposed to, regardless of its source. The team continued developing response strategies until my phone rang once more, this time with a call I had been half expecting since learning of Claire's new legal representation. It was Anton Kuznetsov himself. Alexandra Laurent, he began, his Russian accent still prominent despite years in Western Europe. I think it's time we spoke directly, don't you? Man to man, without all these lawyers and bankers between us. I maintained a neutral tone. Mr. Kuznetsov, what can I do for you? He chuckled, the sound devoid of genuine humor, always so formal, so proper. This is why I've always found you fascinating. You project such control, such precision, but we both know that beneath every orderly structure lie vulnerabilities, yes? Is there a specific matter you wish to discuss? I asked, deliberately avoiding his attempt to establish a psychological framework for the conversation. Direct as always, he replied. Very well. Your wife has retained my associates for representation in what has become an unnecessarily complicated situation. I believe I can facilitate a more efficient resolution. I'm listening, I said, signaling the team to ensure the call was being properly recorded and analyzed. You have built impressive structures, Alexandra. Offshore holdings layered through multiple jurisdictions, client relationships with some of Europe's most discerning wealth holders, banking arrangements that would make most financial strategists envious. These achievements deserve respect. His shift to flattery was transparent but purposeful, establishing that he had significant knowledge of my operations before presenting whatever proposition he had prepared. Unfortunately, he continued, unwinding these structures through conventional divorce proceedings would be extraordinarily time-consuming and likely damaging to many innocent parties. Your clients, your banking partners, perhaps even the broader financial community given your position within it. And you're proposing an alternative approach? I prompted, keeping him on track. A private resolution, Kuznetsov confirmed. One that preserves confidentiality, maintains stability for your clients, and provides appropriate compensation for Claire, without years of legal archaeology, through your financial structures. Now we reach the heart of his proposal. What specifically are you suggesting? A simple exchange, he replied smoothly. Claire will accept a settlement of 50 million Swiss francs paid into designated accounts. In return, she withdraws. All claims to additional assets, signs comprehensive confidentiality agreements, and the entire matter disappears from public and regulatory attention. The amount was substantial but not crippling, precisely calibrated to seem reasonable given the circumstances, but the true purpose wasn't financial. And what would Claire's role be in this arrangement? She seems to have developed sudden expertise in financial matters overnight. Kuznetsov paused briefly, perhaps surprised by my direct acknowledgement of the obvious change in Claire's approach. Claire understands her interests better now than she did previously. I've simply helped her recognize the most efficient path to securing her future. And your interest in facilitating this efficiency? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Let's call it professional courtesy, he replied with false graciousness. One financial strategist helping another avoid unnecessary complications. The banking community in Switzerland is small, Alexandra. None of us benefit from messy public disputes that attract regulatory attention. The true purpose of his call was becoming clear. Not to secure a settlement for Claire, but to establish direct communication for whatever his actual objective might be. The 50 million franc proposal was merely an opening position designed to initiate negotiation rather than resolve the situation. I'll consider your proposal and discuss it with my advisors, I replied non-committally. Is there a specific timeframe you're suggesting for response? Financial markets wait for no one, Kuznetsov said, his tone suddenly colder. I would suggest no more than 48 hours for initial response. After that, certain aspects of the situation may become less controllable. The veiled threat was typical of his approach, implying consequences without making specific statements that could later be used against him. I understand. You'll have my response within that time frame. After ending the call, I turned to my team, and now we have direct confirmation of Kuznetsov's involvement, along with the first indication of his actual objectives, which aren't primarily financial, Sophia observed. The 50 million is substantial, but far less than what a contentious divorce might ultimately cost. He wants something else. Information, I concluded. Access to client relationships. Insight into structures and methodologies. The settlement offer is just the opening move in a different game entirely. The mid-story twist was now clear. What had begun as Claire's betrayal had transformed into something far more complex. A sophisticated intelligence operation using divorce proceedings as its vehicle, with Claire herself now operating as Kuznetsov's direct agent rather than merely his unwitting pawn. Part 12. Strategic Adjustment. With Kuznetsov now directly involved and Claire transformed into his operational asset, I needed to fundamentally recalibrate my approach. The 48-hour deadline provided a narrow window for developing and implementing a comprehensive counter-strategy. I convened my expanded response team at a secure facility outside Geneva, a discreet chalet in the mountains that served as a contingency. Headquarters, unknown to Claire or her new associates. The team now included Heinrich and his legal specialists, Sophia and our financial strategists, Jean-Pierre representing our banking interests, and 2 former intelligence professionals who specialized in corporate counter-espionage. Kuznetsov's approach confirms what we suspected, I began, addressing the assembled team. This isn't about divorce or marital assets. It's an intelligence operation targeting our client relationships, methodologies, and financial structures. Claire is now functioning as his direct agent, rather than merely his unwitting pawn. The evidence was displayed on multiple screens around the room. Claire's sudden shift in behavior, the engagement of Kuznetsov's legal representatives, the anonymous submission to the forensic accountants, and finally, the direct contact from Kuznetsov himself. The 50 million franc settlement offer is merely an opening gambit, I continued. His true objective is gaining access to our inner financial architecture and client network. Once obtained, that intelligence would allow him to approach our clients, replicate our methodologies, and potentially trigger regulatory scrutiny of our operations. Heinrich spoke first. From a legal perspective, we're facing a complex challenge. Claire, as your spouse, has legitimate rights to financial information within divorce proceedings. The court would typically grant significant disclosure requirements, even regarding offshore structures, if they're deemed relevant to marital assets, which creates the perfect cover for intelligence gathering, Sophia added. Information obtained legally through divorce proceedings could be leveraged for competitive purposes without violating banking regulations directly. Jean-Pierre raised a critical concern. The banking community is already receiving indirect approaches. 3 board members reported being contacted by concerned financial colleagues, suggesting that ongoing association with your management structures might represent elevated risk exposure in the current environment. This was classic Kuznetsov methodology, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty around a target's stability to undermine institutional relationships. The approach was particularly effective in Swiss banking circles, where reputation and perceived stability were paramount. We need a fundamental strategic adjustment, I decided. Instead of playing defense against these approaches, we need to shift to a counter-offensive that neutralizes Kuznetsov's leverage while protecting our core assets. The team looked expectant as I outlined the new approach. First, we accept that some level of disclosure is inevitable and prepare accordingly. Second, we develop a counter-proposal that appears responsive to Kuznetsov's offer while actually advancing our interests. Third, we implement protective measures for our client relationships and core methodologies that can't be compromised. Over the next several hours, the team developed a comprehensive response strategy. Heinrich prepared a carefully crafted counter-proposal that would appear to meet Kuznetsov's demands while containing subtle legal tripwires. Sophia developed an approach for presenting certain financial structures in ways that seemed transparent while actually revealing little of value. Jean-Pierre coordinated with banking partners to reinforce confidence and identify potential pressure points Kuznetsov might target. By evening, the counter-strategy was taking shape, but I felt something was still missing, some element that would fundamentally alter the dynamic rather than simply responding to Kuznetsov's moves. The answer came from an unexpected source when Isabel called with new information. Claire received a package today, she reported. She took it directly to Father's study, and they've been reviewing the contents for hours. She seemed disturbed. When I asked if everything was all right, she snapped at me in a way that was completely uncharacteristic. Any indication of what the package contained, I asked. And nothing specific, but I overheard her on the phone afterward saying something about documentation not matching what was promised, and asking if Anton was certain about the approach. This suggested potential friction between Claire and Kuznetsov, perhaps the first crack in their alliance. If Claire was questioning aspects of Kuznetsov's strategy or information, it might provide an opening to drive a wedge between them. There's one more thing, Isabel added. Claire received another call that clearly upset her. I only heard her side, but she kept saying that wasn't our agreement and I won't be disposable in this. After she hung up, she was visibly shaken. This confirmed my developing theory. Claire was beginning to realize she was merely a tool in Kuznetsov's operation, valuable for her legal standing as my spouse, but ultimately expendable once he obtained the information he sought. The recognition of her true position might create an opportunity for a different kind of approach. After ending the call with Isabel, I shared this information with the strategy team. We've been approaching this as a purely financial and legal challenge, I observed, but there's a human element we haven't fully leveraged. Claire is discovering that Kuznetsov views her as disposable. That realization creates vulnerability we can potentially utilize. You're suggesting reaching out to Claire directly? Heinrich asked, his tone suggesting professional concern about contact outside formal legal channels. Not yet, I replied, but we should prepare for that possibility. In the meantime, I want to respond to Kuznetsov's offer with a counter-proposal that might further highlight the divergence between his interests and Claire's. The counter-proposal we crafted was deliberately structured to expose this tension. It offered Claire a substantial settlement, 40 million Swiss francs, with guaranteed immediate access and complete independent control. However, it made this offer contingent on Claire personally signing comprehensive confidentiality agreements without the involvement of her advisors, and included provisions that would give her significant financial independence, but strictly limit information sharing about our financial structures. In essence, the proposal offered Claire financial security while cutting Kuznetsov out of the information access he actually sought. If presented properly, it would force a moment of truth. Would Claire prioritize her financial independence or Kuznetsov's intelligence objectives? At precisely the 47-hour mark of Kuznetsov's deadline, I called him directly. I've considered your proposal, I began without preamble. I have a counteroffer. I'm listening, he replied, his tone suggesting he had expected this response. I outlined the key elements of our counter-proposal, emphasizing the financial benefits to Claire while glossing over the provisions that would restrict information access. The offer provides Claire with substantial resources and independence, which I assume is the primary objective here. There was a brief silence before Kuznetsov responded. An interesting approach, Alexandra, but perhaps somewhat naive. Claire's interests are more complex than simply financial. She deserves complete transparency regarding the marital assets she helped build. Transparency regarding legitimate marital assets is already guaranteed through the court process. I countered smoothly. This proposal simply provides an efficient path to resolution without unnecessary complications. I'll discuss your proposal with Claire and her legal team, Kuznetsov replied, a slight edge now evident in his voice, though I suspect they'll find it insufficient given the circumstances. Of course, I acknowledged. I should note that this offer is specifically for Claire's consideration as my spouse. If other parties have separate interests they wish to pursue, those would need to be addressed through appropriate channels. This deliberate distinction between Claire's interests and his own clearly irritated Kuznetsov. A curious distinction to make, he said coldly. Claire's representation reflects her interests exclusively. I'm pleased to hear that confirmation. I replied, I'll await her personal response to the proposal. After ending the call, I turned to Sophia, who had been monitoring the conversation. He's not pleased with the direct appeal to Claire's interests separate from his own. It creates exactly the pressure point we want, she agreed. Now we need to ensure Claire sees the proposal directly, not just Kuznetsov's interpretation of it. We arranged for the formal counter-proposal to be delivered to Claire through multiple channels, officially through her legal team as required, but also through a separate courier directly to the Valmont estate, marked for her personal attention. Additionally, a third copy was sent to Isabel with a note indicating the importance of Claire reviewing the actual document rather than summaries provided by her advisors. The strategy was designed to force transparency in a situation where Kuznetsov would typically control information flow to maintain leverage. By ensuring Claire had direct access to the proposal, we created the possibility that she might recognize how her interests diverged from Kuznetsov's. The next morning brought the first indication that our approach was having the desired effect. Isabel called to report significant tension at the Valmont estate. Claire received your proposal and insisted on reviewing it personally, despite father and the lawyers suggesting they should assess it first. There was quite an argument. And her reaction, I asked. Complicated, Isabel replied. She was initially angry, calling it an attempt to separate her from her advisors. But then she started asking pointed questions about certain provisions, particularly why her advisors objected so strongly to her having independent control over the settlement funds without their involvement. This was precisely the wedge we had hoped to create, Claire beginning to question whether her representatives truly had her best interests at heart. Has she made any decisions about the proposal? Not explicitly, Isabel answered, but she's requested a private meeting with her attorneys, without father or anyone else present. That's happening this afternoon, while waiting for developments. From that meeting, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Weber, the court-appointed forensic accountant. Mr. Laurent, I wanted to inform you of an unusual development. Mrs. Laurent's legal team has submitted a formal request to narrow the scope of our forensic investigation, specifically excluding certain offshore jurisdictions they initially highlighted as areas of particular concern. This was a telling shift, Kuznetsov attempting to redirect the investigation away from areas where increased scrutiny might reveal his own connections or methods. That seems like a significant change in approach, I noted carefully. Indeed, Dr. Weber agreed, her professional tone not quite concealing her curiosity about this tactical shift, particularly as they've simultaneously requested expedited focus on your client relationship structures and fee arrangements. It suggests a very specific intelligence-gathering objective rather than comprehensive asset identification. Her observation confirmed that Dr. Weber had recognized the unusual nature of the investigation's direction. As an experienced forensic professional, she had clearly identified patterns inconsistent with standard divorce proceedings. I appreciate your noting this development, I replied. I assume you'll continue following the court's original mandate for comprehensive investigation rather than these suggested modifications. The court's mandate remains my primary directive, she confirmed. Though I wanted you to be aware of these attempts to influence the investigative direction. By mid-afternoon, I received two more significant updates in quick succession. First, Sophia reported that our banking partners had identified coordinated outreach to 5 of our largest clients, subtle approaches from financial advisors expressing concerns about our stability and suggesting confidential conversations about alternative asset management options. The second update came from Heinrich, who had received a formal communication from Claire's legal team. They've rejected our counterproposal, he reported, but with an interesting modification. They're now proposing direct negotiations between you and Claire, without advisors present, to discuss a personal resolution to the situation. This represented a substantial shift from the previous approach, where Claire had operated entirely through her legal team and advisors. The request for direct negotiations suggested either that she was asserting independence from Kuznetsov's control, or that this was a new tactical approach to gain information through personal interaction. Set it up, I instructed Heinrich, but with appropriate protections, neutral location, basic recording for legal protection, and clear parameters regarding what can be discussed. As these arrangements were being made, my secure phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I was surprised to hear Claire's voice, the first direct communication since her initial text announcing her departure. Alexandra, she began, her tone difficult to read. I think it's time we talk directly. This situation has become complicated in ways I didn't anticipate. I agree, I replied, maintaining a neutral tone. Heinrich is already arranging a meeting based on your legal team's request. "This isn't about legal teams," she said, a note of frustration evident. "I'm calling you directly because I need to understand something. Did you know about Anton Kuznetsov's history before all this started?" The question suggested Claire was beginning to recognize she might have been manipulated into a situation she didn't fully understand. "I've had professional interactions with him in the past," I answered carefully. "His approach to financial matters and his methods are well documented." "That's a very diplomatic answer," Claire observed, a hint of her former perceptiveness breaking through the persona she had adopted recently. "I'm beginning to think I should have asked more questions earlier in this process." "It's never too late for the right questions," I replied, deliberately avoiding any accusatory or vindictive tone that might undermine this tentative opening. There was a brief silence before Claire spoke again. "I'd like to meet tomorrow. Not with lawyers or advisors or my father, just us. There are things I need to understand directly from you." "I'm open to that," I agreed. "Heinrich can arrange a suitable location." "No," Claire insisted. "Not through the usual channels. There are complications I'd prefer to avoid. I'll text you a location later. Come alone." She hung up before I could respond. This development presented both opportunity and risk. A direct meeting with Claire, outside the structured legal framework, could provide the chance to establish a separate resolution pathway that excluded Kuznetsov and his objectives. However, it could also be a sophisticated trap, an attempt to secure statements or commitments outside proper legal channels that could later be used against me. I shared this development with the core strategy team, seeking their assessment. "It could be genuine recognition on Claire's part that she's been manipulated," Sophia suggested. "The timing aligns with her receiving our counterproposal and likely recognizing the divergence between her interests and Kuznetsov's. Or it could be a new tactical approach," countered one of our intelligence advisors. "Kuznetsov might have recognized that the formal legal channels are yielding limited results and decided on a more personal approach to extract information or commitments." Both possibilities had merit, requiring a balanced response that remained open to reconciliation while maintaining appropriate caution. "We'll proceed with the meeting," I decided, "but with enhanced security protocols and careful preparation regarding what can be discussed. If Claire is genuinely recognizing Kuznetsov's manipulation, this could create an opportunity to resolve the situation in a way that protects both our interests." As the team developed protocols for the upcoming meeting, I received a text from Claire with coordinates for a location in Lausanne, a public park overlooking Lake Geneva, far from our usual environments in the banking and legal districts. The choice was telling: a neutral open space that would make surveillance or recording difficult for either party, suggesting Claire had genuine concerns about privacy from her own advisors. The strategic adjustment was complete. What had begun as a defensive response to Claire's betrayal had evolved into a sophisticated counteroffensive that targeted the alliance between Claire and Kuznetsov. By highlighting the divergence in their interests and creating pathways for Claire to recognize her manipulation, we had potentially created an opening for resolution that would neutralize the broader threat while addressing the immediate divorce situation. As I prepared for the meeting with Claire, I reviewed the intelligence we had gathered on Kuznetsov's operations and Claire's recent activities. The picture that emerged suggested Claire was indeed experiencing second thoughts about her alliance with Kuznetsov, particularly as his true objectives became clearer. Whether this recognition would translate into a genuine opportunity for resolution remained to be seen, but the stage was set for a potential turning point in this complex financial chess match. The Lausanne park Claire had chosen offered panoramic views of Lake Geneva, the Swiss and French Alps rising majestically across the Water. I arrived 30 minutes early, allowing time to survey the location and ensure appropriate security measures were in place. 2 members of my security team had established discreet positions nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but distant enough to respect the privacy of our conversation. I selected a bench with clear sight lines in all directions, positioned where approaching visitors would be visible well before they reached me. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, a tranquil setting, incongruous with the high-stakes financial and personal confrontation about to unfold. At precisely the appointed time, I saw Claire approaching along the lakeside path. She walked alone, her manner more reminiscent of the woman I had known for 15 years than the cold, calculating persona she had adopted in recent weeks. She wore a simple grey coat rather than her usual designer attire, and had chosen practical boots over the stilettos she typically favoured for important meetings. The deliberate understatement spoke volumes about her current mindset. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat beside me, maintaining a carefully measured distance on the bench. Her eyes scanned our surroundings with practiced caution before settling on me. "Are we alone?" "As alone as prudence allows," I replied honestly. "Security is nearby, but not within earshot. Are you being followed?" "Almost certainly," she acknowledged with a grim smile. "But I've taken precautions. Used a staff member's car, left my phone at home, took several detours. I have perhaps 30 minutes before questions arise about my absence." I studied her face, noting the fatigue evident beneath her carefully applied makeup. The past weeks had clearly taken a toll, despite her projected confidence in court and legal filings. "You wanted to talk directly," I prompted. "I'm listening." Claire took a deep breath, her composure wavering momentarily before she steadied herself. "I've made a terrible mistake, Alexandra. Not just leaving you, though that was certainly a mistake, but involving myself with people whose objectives I didn't fully understand." "Kuznetsov," I said simply. She nodded. "At first, I believed Marcus was genuinely interested in me. When he introduced me to Anton, it seemed like fortunate timing, someone who could help me secure what I felt I deserved from our marriage. It was only after Marcus disappeared that I began to realize how calculated it all had been. This confirmation of her manipulation aligned with our intelligence assessment, but hearing it directly from Claire carried different weight. "When did you recognize Kuznetsov's true objectives?" "It happened gradually," she admitted. "At first, his guidance seemed focused on securing a favorable settlement, but the questions became increasingly specific: client names, transaction methodologies, fee structures, information that had nothing to do with our marital assets." She looked away, watching a sailboat cutting across the lake. "When I questioned the relevance, Anton explained they were building leverage to ensure you wouldn't hide assets. It seemed plausible initially, but the focus remained on those areas even after the court-appointed forensic accountants," I finished for her. "Exactly." She turned back to me, her expression troubled. "The breaking point came 3 days ago. I overheard Anton on a call discussing how my usefulness would diminish once certain information was secured. He was already planning the next phase of whatever operation this is, something involving regulatory authorities and your client relationships. This intelligence was valuable confirmation of our assessment of Kuznetsov's broader strategy." "What do you want from this meeting, Claire? Why reach out directly after everything that's happened?" She hesitated, clearly wrestling with both pride and pragmatism. "I want out," she finally admitted, "out of whatever game Kuznetsov is playing. I realize now I was never more than a convenient tool for him, a legal standing he could leverage to access information he couldn't obtain otherwise." "And what are you proposing?" I kept my tone neutral, despite the significance of this potential opening. "A genuine settlement between us," Claire replied. Not the theatrical performance in court, not the manipulated legal maneuvers, but an actual resolution. I'll accept your counter-proposal, the 40 million with independent control. I'll sign whatever confidentiality agreements are necessary. In exchange, I want your help extracting myself from Kuznetsov's influence without becoming his target. The request was reasonable given the circumstances, but execution would be complex. Kuznetsov doesn't relinquish assets or instruments easily, I noted, and you've become a significant asset in his operation against me. I know, Claire acknowledged. That's why I need your help. You understand his methods better than I do, and you have resources I don't have access to. I considered the proposition carefully. Helping Claire extract herself from Kuznetsov's control could potentially neutralize a significant threat vector while resolving the divorce situation efficiently. However, it would require careful orchestration to prevent Kuznetsov from recognizing the alliance and implementing contingency measures. If we proceed with this approach, I said after a thoughtful pause, we would need absolute discretion. Any indication that you're working with me would trigger immediate countermeasures from Kuznetsov. I understand, Claire affirmed. I can maintain the appearance of alignment with him while we develop an exit strategy. He still believes I'm fully committed to his approach, simply asking for more direct involvement in the legal proceedings. This created a potential opening for a sophisticated counter-operation, using Claire's position within Kuznetsov's network to gather intelligence while gradually extracting her from his influence. It was risky but potentially elegant in its execution. There's something else you should know, Claire added, her voice dropping slightly. Anton has established connections with regulatory authorities in Geneva and Zurich. He's preparing to trigger investigations into your client fee structures and cross-border transaction methodologies once he obtains specific documentation he believes exists. This was valuable intelligence, confirming our concerns about regulatory manipulation as part of Kuznetsov's broader strategy. What documentation specifically? Something called Protocol Omega, Claire replied, watching my reaction carefully. He believes it contains methodologies that would trigger regulatory scrutiny if exposed in the current compliance environment. The reference to Protocol Omega was particularly concerning. It was indeed a documented methodology for certain cross-border transactions, entirely legal, but potentially controversial if presented without proper context to regulatory authorities. That Kuznetsov knew of its existence suggested a deeper intelligence penetration than we had previously identified. Thank you for that information, I acknowledged. It's significant and helpful. Claire nodded, a hint of her former confident self emerging briefly. I may have made a terrible mistake, Alexandra, but I'm not without resources or intelligence. I've been gathering information since I realized Kuznetsov's true objectives. I have documentation of his approaches to regulatory officials, records of his conversations regarding plans for your client relationships, even drafts of the anonymous complaints he intends to file once he obtains sufficient supporting evidence. This was an unexpected development. Claire had been conducting her own counterintelligence operation while appearing to cooperate with Kuznetsov's strategies. It suggested a level of foresight and adaptability I had underestimated. Why share this with me now? I asked, seeking to understand her full motivation. Self-preservation primarily, she admitted candidly. I've seen how Kuznetsov operates, how he discards people once their usefulness ends. Marcus was just the first example. There have been others in his organization who suddenly relocated or pursued other opportunities when they questioned aspects of his approach. Her candor was refreshing after weeks of legal posturing and strategic maneuvering. What you're proposing is essentially an alliance against Kuznetsov, I observed. Given recent history, trust is naturally a concern. Understand that Claire acknowledged. "I don't expect you to trust me based on a single conversation, but I'm prepared to demonstrate good faith through actions rather than words." She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small encrypted flash drive. "This contains everything I've gathered on Kuznetsov's operation, his contacts within regulatory bodies, his approach strategies for your clients, his planned anonymous filings. Consider it a down payment on rebuilding some measure of trust." I accepted the drive, recognizing its potential value while maintaining appropriate skepticism about its contents. "This will need verification," I noted. "Of course," Claire agreed. "I wouldn't expect anything less." We spent the next 20 minutes outlining a basic framework for cooperation, communication protocols, information sharing parameters, and preliminary steps for Claire's extraction from Kuznetsov's influence. The approach would need refinement with input from the broader strategy team, but the foundation was solid. As our meeting neared its conclusion, Claire addressed the personal aspect that had been carefully sidestepped in our strategic discussion. "I owe you an apology, Alexandre. Not just for the financial disruption or legal complications, but for betraying 15 years of partnership. Whatever issues existed in our marriage, they didn't justify my actions." I appreciated the apology, but maintained professional distance. Our personal relationship and the current strategic situation are separate matters. We can address the former once the latter is resolved. Claire nodded, accepting this boundary. "Fair enough. For now, we focus on neutralizing Kuznetsov and establishing a settlement that serves both our interests." As she prepared to leave, following the circuitous route she had planned to avoid surveillance, she paused. "One last thing. You should know, Philippe is not willingly involved with Kuznetsov. He believes he's simply helping me secure a fair settlement. If he understood the true nature of Kuznetsov's operation, his banking ethics would never allow his participation." This information about her father added another potential dimension to our counter-strategy. Philippe's banking connections were invaluable to Kuznetsov, but if he recognized his manipulation, those same connections could become a significant liability. "I'll keep that in mind," I assured her. "We'll be in contact through the secure channel we discussed." After Claire departed, I waited 15 minutes before leaving, taking a different path to where my driver waited at a secondary location. During that walk, I processed the implications of this unexpected development. Claire's outreach and the intelligence she provided created an opportunity to transform the dynamic completely, from defensive protection against a coordinated attack to a counter-offensive that could potentially neutralize Kuznetsov's operation entirely. Upon returning to the secure facility, I briefed the strategy team on the meeting's outcomes and the potential alliance with Claire. The intelligence she had provided was immediately submitted for verification and analysis, with preliminary results confirming its authenticity and value. "This changes our strategic calculus significantly," Sophia observed as we reviewed the findings. "If Claire is genuinely working against Kuznetsov while maintaining the appearance of cooperation, we have an unprecedented intelligence advantage." Heinrich was more cautious. "While the opportunity is significant, we should consider the possibility that this is an elaborate counter-intelligence operation. Kuznetsov using Claire to feed us selected information while gathering intelligence on our response patterns. It was a legitimate concern, requiring appropriate verification and validation protocols for all information exchanged." "We'll proceed with calibrated trust," I decided. "Verify everything, compartmentalize sensitive information, and establish tripwires that would indicate manipulation." Over the following week, a carefully orchestrated counter-operation unfolded. Claire maintained her apparent alignment with Kuznetsov while providing critical intelligence about his approaches to regulatory authorities and clients. Our team used this information to implement preventative measures, briefing clients about potential approaches, preparing comprehensive responses to anticipated regulatory inquiries, and strengthening the documentation supporting our methodologies. Simultaneously, we developed Claire's extraction strategy. Heinrich prepared settlement documents matching our counter-proposal, ready for immediate execution when the moment was right. Security professionals developed protocols for ensuring Claire's physical safety during the transition. Financial structures were established to facilitate the settlement transfer while maintaining appropriate protections. The critical moment came 10 days after our initial meeting in the park. Kuznetsov had scheduled a strategy session with Claire and her legal team to prepare for a major court filing, one designed to compel disclosure of specific client information under the guise of asset division. Claire had provided us with complete details of the planned approach, enabling both defensive measures and a potential countermove. "He'll be fully committed to this filing," Claire explained during a secure communication. "It represents the culmination of his information-gathering strategy. If it fails, he'll be forced to reevaluate his entire approach." This created an opportunity for simultaneous actions on multiple fronts. While Kuznetsov focused on the court filing, we implemented a coordinated response involving banking partners, regulatory contacts, and Claire herself. Jean-Pierre activated our banking defense protocol, providing key institutions with verified information about Kuznetsov's planned approaches and regulatory manipulation attempts. Sophia coordinated with trusted regulatory contacts, ensuring they understood the context of any anonymous filings they might receive. Heinrich prepared legal countermeasures designed to highlight the inappropriate targeting of client information unrelated to marital assets. Most critically, Claire executed her extraction plan. While ostensibly reviewing documents for the court filing, she signed the settlement agreement we had prepared, formally accepting the 40 million franc settlement with independent control. She then activated the secure communication channel we had established, confirming completion of this critical step. With the settlement agreement legally executed, Claire no longer served as a useful instrument in Kuznetsov's strategy. Her legal standing as my spouse pursuing divorce proceedings, the foundation of his information access strategy, had been neutralized through legitimate resolution of the marital situation. The final phase of our counter-operation involved Philippe Valmont. Claire had arranged a private meeting with her father, where she presented verified evidence of Kuznetsov's manipulation and true objectives. As she had predicted, Philippe's banking ethics and family loyalty overrode any lingering antagonism toward me. Once he recognized how Kuznetsov had manipulated both him and Claire, he activated his own considerable influence within Swiss banking circles. The combined effect of these coordinated actions was comprehensive. Kuznetsov's carefully constructed operation collapsed under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Banking institutions withdrew cooperation based on Philippe's warnings about potential regulatory impropriety. Regulatory authorities recognized the pattern of manipulation in the anonymous filings they received. Claire's settlement eliminated the legal vehicle for information access, and most critically, the intelligence Claire had provided allowed us to protect the specific documentation and methodologies Kuznetsov had targeted. 3 weeks after our meeting in the park, I received confirmation that Kuznetsov had departed Switzerland, returning to his primary base in Cyprus. Intelligence sources reported significant disruption within his organization, suggesting our counter-operation had affected not just his campaign against me, but his broader standing in certain financial circles. The formal conclusion of my marriage to Claire proceeded with remarkable efficiency compared to the theatrical legal battles that had characterized the initial phases. The settlement agreement was processed through simplified proceedings, with both parties acknowledging the terms as fair and reasonable. Claire received the agreed 40 million francs, transferred to accounts under her exclusive control, and signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements regarding both personal and financial matters. 6 months later, I received a handwritten note from an unmarked envelope delivered to my office. The Geneva postmark and elegant handwriting were immediately recognizable. Alexandre, I've settled in Barcelona, far from both Geneva and Marcus's known haunts. The gallery I've opened focuses on emerging European artists, building on knowledge that began with genuine interest, despite its unfortunate exploitation. The settlement has provided the independence to build something meaningful on my own terms. Perhaps that's what I was truly seeking all along, though the path I chose was unconscionable. I've heard your asset management firm continues to thrive. The banking community's confidence appears unshaken by last year's complications. Kuznetsov's operation failed in its objectives, professionally and personally. There are consequences to choices that can never be undone. Trust, once broken, doesn't simply regenerate, but understanding can perhaps exist where reconciliation cannot. With respect and gratitude for your measured response to unconscionable actions. Claire. I placed the note in my desk drawer rather than the secure file where all other documentation related to the case was stored. Some communications belong to the personal realm rather than the strategic. As I looked out over Lake Geneva from my office window, I reflected on the unexpected journey from Claire's initial betrayal to the complex counter-operation that had ultimately neutralized Kuznetsov's threat. The offshore millions she had forgotten, or more accurately, never fully understood, had indeed protected our financial interests as designed. But equally important had been the strategic patience, intelligence gathering, and carefully calibrated responses that transformed a potentially devastating attack into an opportunity for systematic defense. In the world of high finance, as in chess, the player who anticipates future positions while maintaining strategic flexibility invariably prevails. Claire and Kuznetsov had initiated a game they believed they controlled, only to discover too late that they had never fully understood the board on which they played. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.